yourself, okay? Just to welcome everyone, you know, what this symposium is all about.
But you will already say that. We don't
need to finish the opening remark. You know, I will say now, like, why don't we open the floor and welcome our panelists for session 1, and I will introduce you as the chair of session 1.
Did you send me the Klepach CV?
Yes, yes, on your email.
Oh my God. Okay. Yes. Okay.
Did you get it?
No, it came without an attachment.
But there was no attachment. That's right, because I just I just print the one I found on the website.
So there isn't. It's not. It's not in
just
the
a text.
It's not. It did not copy it.
Okay. I'm resend it now.
Yes. Where do I find the full program?
I email you.
The full program?
Yes.
So many things.
Okay, I am used to last minute.
So did you send the Klepach?
Yes, I sent Klepach as the program.
No, listen, the Klepach does not come through.
Okay, Natalia.
There is an email which is empty.
Natalia. Let me ask Natalia.
Unless I can go to the site.
Yes, I hear you.
Natalia, I'm sorry. Can you send to Jacob Klepach bio, please?
Send what?
The bio of Klepach.
Okay. Yes, I will send him in a minute. Just a minute.
Hey, I'm in contact.
Hello.
Oh.
This is Mr. Jacob. This is Professor Klepach here.
Yeah. Oh, how are you? Nice to meet you. Dzień dobry. Good to see you.
Okay.
Dear colleagues, can we start?
Yes.
Rector can begin our meeting.
Please.
Please, okay.
Marc, he needs to send it to me.
Уважаемые, будем начинать, коллеги. Я думаю, что уже время подошло. Let's start.
Yeah.
Уважаемые участники, гости, дамы и господа, рад вас приветствовать на международном симпозиуме «Постковидная эпоха мировой экономики, переосмысления и реконструирования». Уважаемый господин Узан, уважаемый господин Voepel, уважаемый господин Френкель, для нашего университета большая честь быть соорганизатором столь значимого авторитетного международного мероприятия, география спикеров которого охватывает более 15 стран. Мы очень рады, что удалось собрать на единой площадке экспертов с мировым именем, представителей разных международных институтов и организаций. Данная дискуссионная площадка создает предпосылки для консолидации мировой общественности, выработки подходов к решению глобальных вызовов настоящего времени. Признателен нашим партнерам за внимание и дружеское отношение к России, за готовность к совместной работе и сотрудничеству, в основе которых лежит понимание взаимных интересов и, конечно, доверие друг к другу. Мы видим, что последние годы доверие в чем-то было подорвано, и, конечно, наша задача сохранить и укрепить это отношение между учеными разных стран. Программа симпозиума многогранна и охватывает различные аспекты трансформации глобальной экономики, изменения международной финансовой архитектуры и торговли, проблемы развития региональной интеграции, вопросы цифровизации мировой экономики и денежного обращения, проблемы обеспечения качества жизни человека, вопросы трансформации современного города, глобальные экологические и климатические проблемы, вопросы перехода к низкоуглеродной экономике. Пандемия, ставшая серьезным вызовом всему человечеству, лишь обострила проблемы и дисбалансы, которые ранее копились на нашей планете. Мы видим кризис существующей модели экономических отношений. Ключевой вопрос сегодня – как выстраивать логику действий, чтобы не просто восстановить глобальную и национальную экономики, пострадавшие от последствий пандемии, а добиться того, чтобы такое восстановление было именно устойчивым, в долгосрочной перспективе, имела качественную структуру, помогала преодолеть груз социальных дисбалансов. Косметические меры в рамках сохранения базовой капиталистической парадигмы не могут дать гарантированный выход из кризиса. Единственный принципиальный выход – создание новой модели развития. Мы уже достаточно много говорим, и в России эта тема поднимается уже последние лет 17, поэтому мы считаем, что, конечно, сегодня мы стоим на очень таком переломном этапе развития, и сегодняшний симпозиум позволит нам коснуться этих тем достаточно остро. В прошлом году падение глобальной экономики стало максимальным со времен Второй мировой войны. Потери рынка труда к концу 2020 года составили почти 250 миллионов утраченных рабочих мест. Только за первые 9 месяцев прошлого года потери трудового дохода в мире составили $3,5 триллиона. И этот показатель продолжает расти. А значит, растет и социальная напряженность в обществе в различных странах. При этом посткризисное восстановление идет непросто. Если 20-30 лет назад проблему можно было бы решить за счет стимулирующей макроэкономической политики, то сегодня такие механизмы уже по сути исчерпали себя и почти не работают. По оценкам Международного валютного фонда, уровень совокупного долга государственного и частного сектора вплотную приблизился к отметке в 200% глобального ВВП, а в отдельных экономиках он превысил 300% национального ВВП. При этом в развитых странах процентные ставки повсеместно находятся практически на нулевой отметке, а в ключевых развивающихся на исторически минимальных уровнях. Конечно, все это нас беспокоит как ученых-экономистов. Все это делает стимулирование экономики традиционными инструментами за счет наращивания частного кредитования по сути невозможным. Так называемое количественное смягчение, которое только раздувает пузырь стоимости финансовых активов, ведет к дальнейшему расслоению в обществе. А нарастающий разрыв между реальной и виртуальной экономикой представляет реальную угрозу и чреват серьезным, непредсказуемым потрясением. Модель глобализации, предложенная в конце 20 века, все меньше соответствует стремительно формирующейся новой экономической реальности. Принципы свободы торговли, частной и открытой конкуренции заменяются языком торговых войн и санкций. Несмотря на сложность стоящих вызовов и противоречий, нам нужно, безусловно, не утрачивать позитивный взгляд на будущее. Нужно сохранять приверженность к созидательной повестке. И сегодня она у нас созидательная повестка. Нам важно слышать друг друга, объединять усилия для решения общих задач. По итогам сегодняшних рабочих дней, мы работаем сегодня и завтра, уважаемые коллеги, мы планируем подготовить совместное коммюнике, которое отразит нашу солидарную позицию по основным направлениям развития глобальной экономики. Мы очень надеемся, что сегодняшние и завтрашние встречи станут основой долгосрочного сотрудничества ведущих экономистов планеты. Спасибо.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Rector. It's a great pleasure for the Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee to cooperate with your university. I think you are celebrating your 90th anniversary birthday. And with my co-host, the Hamburg Institute for International Economics and the Frenkel-Zuckerman Institute, it's a great honor to be able for the next 2 days, to team together and to put together a very high-level symposium that brings, as you said, more than 15 countries represented, and to try to discuss not only the short-term economic outlook for the global economy, but the long-term. That's why we call it redefining and redesigning the global economy. And I wanted to start my remarks, in fact, why we choose that title. I think we didn't put reinventing, but as you know, since the COVID-19, the concept of reinventing is everywhere. We need to reinvent our growth model. We need to reinvent multilateralism. We need to reinvent the way we deal with pandemic all over the world. And this is in fact what the G20 was all about to do. You remember the different financial crises that occurred in the 1990s and the great financial crisis in 2008 that elevated the G20 at the leaders level. And now, this initiative with this conference is all about to think about the post-virus order. And I believe that we are not going to go back to the previous growth model. And we need to think and to define a new growth model that's going to be based on sustainability and social compatibility that's going to be at the heart of the world economy moving forward. And of course, this is all about also inclusive multilateralism. And in order to do that, we need to think about a major reallocations of capital and labor around the world, not only for the advanced countries, but also for the emerging market. But before we go to this long-term challenge, we need to deal with the short-term economic outlook. As everyone knows, the policy response all over the world has been dramatic. The whatever it takes has been really implemented all over the world, particularly in the advanced countries versus the emerging market. And I know that this short-term economic outlook, is still dealing with the greatest recession that we had since the 1929. But there are risks towards this scenario because we are still doing with a stop and go in terms of economic activity. And of course, what is maybe most concern in the short-term point of view is maybe the risk of divergence in the global economy, because some part of the world might be growing quicker than the rest of the world. So that's why international cooperation will be more needed to try to really think about orchestrating international policy coordinations when we are going to get out of this COVID-19 and this pandemic. And of course, the second point is all about normalization of macroeconomic policies. You remember, all of us here, that in order to deal with the great financial crisis, there was a whatever it takes moment with monetary policy. And now it has been all about fiscal policy. And the big challenge for macroeconomics will be to try to deal with this new interdependence between fiscal and monetary policy moving forward. Of course, as we are called, our institution is entitled Reinventing Bretton Woods. This is more critical than ever to orchestrate international cooperations. And I think the big thing would be how we can revitalize international cooperation, international coordination in the next decade. I think it's maybe more difficult for policymakers to deal with cooperation and coordination when you can do face-to-face meeting, because cooperation has always been less protocol, bringing together the key policymakers and to come up with some concrete solutions. I think redesigning and redefining the global economy, that's what has been the challenge of this conference, and what we wanted to go out is a short-term macroeconomic outlook, but moving forward to questions that are going to define the next decade, the future of money, and should central bank issue central bank digital currency, what will happen for the international monetary system, is going to be about international cooperation and the future of multilateralism. We have been seeing over the last decade a rising of new institutions, AIIB, the BRIC, the new development bank? Are we seeing a fragmented global governance? That will be one of the questions we will raise. And of course, what will be post-COVID, the future of global finance and the future of global trade? That's going to be another big challenge moving forward. And of course, you know, policymakers, you have a change in the US administrations who already send signals that they want to go back to the international machinery of corporations. And of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is all about sustainable development goals. This is all about inclusive growth and inclusive multilateralism, and how we are going to move forward to come up with what the G20 recently mentioned in a creation of a new working group, the common public goods. So without ado, let me thank my co-host, you know, the Hamburg Institute, the St. Petersburg, and all the staff for making this conference, you know, a reality, and all the work behind it, even it's on a Zoom discussions, and the Frenkel-Zuckerman Institute who are joining us, you know, to be part and putting this program together. And of course, all the speakers around the world, from China to Russia, from emerging market to Europe, who have accepted our invitations. Over to you, Henning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marc. You can't see me because I've just passed my first COVID test positively, so it was negative, and I'm sitting in a room, so you can't see me. So welcome to the audience from wherever you are listening and watching. So this is another great opportunity, I think, to discuss the crisis and all the topics we have seen even before the crisis. And so first of all, I would like to thank the organizers, Marc, especially you, and Igor and Jacob. This is, I'm very grateful for cooperating and having brought to stage this special conference. And I think we know from the past that when we had a crisis of such a dimension, the aftermath of such a crisis was very decisive. So we will have some decisive moments in the aftermath of the crisis. And I think this can be an opportunity to shape, to redefine the global economy, but it can also be a threat. So I think we should be aware of the critical moments. And well, I think to discuss all these topics together and to create change and cooperation is decisive, is very important because we have some fundamental and paradigmatic changes ahead of us. So I'm again very grateful to come together with some high-level speakers in the next 2 days. And so I don't have so much to add to what has been said before. So I would like to stop here and to hand over to Jacob. So thanks, and I'm wishing us some great discussions throughout the next 2 days. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The microphone was handed to me. Marc, is it okay?
Yes, very good.
I'm delighted to join this extraordinary group in an extraordinary event. But I will not start properly if I did not identify especially the intellectual father of this business, which is really Marc Uzan, the founder and the turbo behind those international conferences and meetings that he has produced extraordinarily important public good. Okay. And of course, I appreciate very much the hospitality of our host. We are talking online, but really the St. Petersburg State University of Economics. And it only shows you that geography matters much less, because at the same time, we are hosted by the important institute that Henning Voepel just introduced us. In other words, and this is the theme of these conferences, namely, distances are shrinking, and distances are not just geography. We will spend some time on geography, on the issue of cities, on the issues of trade, which have to do with distances. But really what we have learned in this era is the fact that gaps are in so many areas, in geography, in politics, in science, in technology, and the interconnectivity is a fact. And what the system is supposed to do is to make the best of this fact, to make it a workable fact, to internalize the externalities, and to prevent disturbances to this interconnection. The title of the conference is very optimistic. It speaks about the post-COVID era. Well, I must say, those who designed it must be very, very optimistic, because I think that we will probably stay within the era of the COVID for a long time. Not only the COVID as a virus, but the COVID as a syndrome that highlights how science, technology, medicine, people, travel, interaction are going to shape our new world. Who would have thought 2 years ago to have this conference online? We would all have gone to airports, we will all go to registration, to hotels, we will have a social program to make sure that everything works well, and people from the hot countries will go to the cold countries. Here you see that your comfort, in a way, you save resources, you lose some of the human touch, but you are creating a new system of interconnectivity. So yes, it is the post-COVID era in the long-term sense, but it is the COVID syndrome that we will stay with us. And therefore, the world has to be reacting to it. And yesterday is an important part of history in the sense of teaching us lessons, but we need to redesign it. We need to identify where the obstacles were and how can we make sure that those obstacles are being overcome. I think that the fact that the shock to the world started from the health area, an area that is not necessarily the day-to-day engagement of the participants in this conference, but it impacted hugely the economy, the politics, etc., which comes to show that science, technology are universal. And I think that by now we all also have learned that those who deny reality are going to fall behind and even tragically lose their life. And those who are respecting science and technology develop vaccines, become ready for the new world. So let me just say that while we are a group of social scientists and economists, etc., the implications are profound for everything. So I would also say that it is not a single conference. It's a guidepost along a series of conferences. And maybe these meetings in maybe the same form or somewhat different form will continue as an ongoing building, because as you can see, the title does not speak about the new world or the redesigned world or the redefined world, but rather a call for action, designing, defining. It is an ongoing process, and this interaction is part of it. So in this regard, I want to appreciate very much the opportunity of the organizers and to return the microphone again to Marc Uzan. Thank you very much, Marc.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you very much. And I think now we have our panelists for session one that we're going to start. How COVID-19 has changed the world economy. And Jacob, I'm very pleased that you have agreed to share the sessions. Maybe before I give you the floor back, let me maybe introduce to you to our audience and our panelists. You know, you have been governor of the Bank of Israel, you have been vice chairman of JP Morgan Chase International for many years, and the chairman of the board of trustees of the G30, and now you are sharing also the Frenkel-Zuckerman Institute for Global Economics. You have a long and distinguished career in global economy, in global finance, and providing, you know, strong intellect among policymakers, academic on the global finance and the global financial architecture. I'm very pleased that you can join us today to share not only these sessions, but also to co-host this conference, to try really, as you mentioned at the beginning, not only to a call for actions to redefine and to redesign the global economy. Jacob, over to you for sharing the sessions, and I welcome also all our panelists, Richard Koo, Professor Andrés Rodríguez-Pose, Andrei Klepach, Qiao Yide from China, and Professor Jacques Sapir from Paris. Welcome all of you, and thank you for accepting our invitation. Jacob.
Thank you very much. And now that we have had lengthy opening remarks, we can jump straight to the water. We will not spend much time in introducing the speakers. Their bios are in the side, in the documents that were circulated to you. But I will only say that we are fortunate to have a fantastic cast of speakers that will enrich our knowledge. Our time is limited, like always in life, and we have 5 presentations, and we need to conclude in about, we will give each presentation about, say, about 12, 13 minutes or whatever, in order to make sure that we reach on time as we move on. I cannot promise you a coffee break, but I can promise you the freedom to take coffee wherever you sit. The first speaker, as appropriately, because I think of this as being now in the global world, I will go to Andrei Klepach, who is well, he's of course he's now the chief economist of the State Development Corporation in Russia, has had a very distinguished career in economic policy, has covered the main important challenges of economy, whether it is from inflation, etc. You can read about his bio, and without any further ado, I will go directly to Mr. Klepach. Please, the floor is yours. Go ahead. The word that has been always mentioned in the context of these Zoom meetings is, please unmute yourself. Mr. Klepach, I saw him earlier. We'll give it one more minute, and if
Андрей
not...
Николаевич, вы нас слышите? Вы можете начать первым выступать?
Да, я слышу.
Okay, now, very good. The floor is yours. And by the way, you can choose which language you listen to. There is the simultaneous translation. Please.
Okay. Dear colleagues, it's a big honor for me to participate in such a conference and discuss with you the problem of global economy. But I try maybe focus on, especially on the situation in Russian economy, some lesson of our adaptation to the pandemic and world crisis. Maybe I will continue in Russian, but if it's more comfortable for you, I can back to English. Российская экономика, как и экономики мировых стран, столкнулась также с достаточно тяжелым ударом, связанным с пандемией. Но для России особую роль играет, как нефтяной страны, падение цен на нефть, которое было связано и усилено общим сжатием мировой экономики из-за пандемии, но и общим дисбалансом на мировом рынке. И отсюда присоединением России вместе с другими странами к соглашению ОПЕК о сокращении добычи нефти. В этой ситуации, ну, в целом можно сказать, что мы прошли кризис с меньшими потерями, чем это ожидалось в начале и даже в середине года. Первая оценка, которую дал Росстат о падении ВВП в России, это 3,1%. По сути дела, основной спад пришелся на второй квартал, и дальше экономика начала оживать. Несмотря на второй скачок более тяжелой пандемии осенью падение ВВП не произошло, поскольку все-таки такого локдауна, как европейские страны, в России не вводилось. Вот. Поэтому в целом экономика вышла из кризиса лучше, чем это ожидалось раньше. Масштаб мер поддержки, он в чем-то, то есть по масштабу существенно уступал, чем в европейских странах. Оценка, которая у нас есть с учетом гарантийных мер, это порядка 3 с лишним, около 4%. ВВП это существенно меньше, чем в европейских странах. Вот. Поддержка была также направлена во многом на поддержку доходов. God bless you. Доходов семей, помощи тем, кто потерял работу. И, с другой стороны, поддержка, в первую очередь, малого бизнеса. В этом плане набор мер достаточно типичен. Может быть, особенностью России являлось то, что мы для скорости доведения денег до населения значительную часть поддержки проводили для многодетных семей, ну, потому что уровень дохода у них низкий, в случае потери работы это являлось достаточно большой проблемой. Во-вторых, в системе поддержки малого бизнеса, а также предприятий для того, чтобы они поддерживали занятость, большую роль сыграли институты развития и, в первую очередь, Внешэкономбанк, через которого шло предоставление госгарантий по кредитам, да, и определенная часть самого кредитования. А так, я бы не сказал, что здесь есть какие-то ноу-хау. Может быть, существенным отличием от европейских стран являлось то, что все-таки жесткого локдауна не вводилось. У нас были закрыты общественные мероприятия, ограничена, ну, вначале прекращена работа ресторанов, кафе, увеселительных заведений, но промышленность, за малым исключением, продолжала свою работу. Где-то часть персонала была переведена на удаленный дистанционный доступ, но продолжалась работа и промышленных предприятий, строительства, особенно связанного с развитием и строительством дорожной инфраструктуры и жилья. Хотя в целом, тем не менее, спад в экономике был, и по оценке пока предварительным, они будут еще уточняться, реальные доходы населения сократились на 3,5%. Если бы не эти меры поддержки, по нашей оценке спад был бы более 5%. Инвестиции сократились на накопление капитала на 4,2%. Вот. Ну и розничная торговля на 4,1%. По сути дела, по нашей оценке, меры поддержки для экономики дали где-то 2 процентных пункта ВВП. Тем не менее, если говорить об уроках и о дальнейших перспективах, один из главных вызовов и вопросов, а насколько экономика дальше сможет и как быстро восстановить докризисный уровень, когда удастся компенсировать потери доходов населения, ну и когда восстановится предпринимательская уверенность. Официальный правительственный прогноз, он достаточно оптимистичен, и, в принципе, он, как ни странно, крайний прогноз МВФ оказался к нему близок, это 3% рост в текущем году. Я думаю, что все-таки рост будет несколько слабее, 2 с лишним процента. В первую очередь, не за счет потребительского спроса, потому что он будет восстанавливаться, и мы думаем, что доходы населения за 2021 год почти полностью компенсируют провал 2020-го. Но инвестиционное поведение предприятий, бизнеса, оно пока остается более осторожным, несмотря на инвестиции таких поддержанных государством компаний, как РЖД, Газпром, нефтяники. Но частный бизнес пока, как я думаю, не готов к массированным инвестициям, хотя есть специальный пакет мер, и правительство дополнительно сейчас прорабатывает стимулирующие меры, которые направлены уже именно на развитие экономики. То есть у нас принят такой план восстановления экономического роста, и сейчас идет работа по подготовке таких более стратегических решений, которые должны изменить качество экономики, ее инновационную технологическую направленность, по сути дела, сформировать новый социальный контракт, в том числе связанный с новым качеством услуг здравоохранения, социальной помощи. Пока финансовые параметры этих предложений не ясны, идет проработка скорее качественных вещей и механизмов, но эксперты ожидают, что уже даже в этом году последуют дополнительные меры по поддержке доходов населения и пенсий, потому что мы уже много лет обсуждаем пенсионную реформу, но, по сути дела, ее контуры так и не определены, не согласованы. И обсуждается пакет мер по поддержке именно инвестиционной активности через принятый закон о защите инвестиций частного бизнеса, который, в общем-то, позволяет давать длительные соглашения, заключать длительные соглашения с компаниями, которые планируют крупные инвестиционные проекты, обеспечивающие в том числе и рост занятости, создание новых рабочих мест. Я думаю, что к весной вот эти планы правительства, такого нового стратегического подъема российской экономики, они уже определятся, и тогда можно будет оценить, насколько они позволят поднять темпы роста и решить особенно социальные проблемы. Я бы, может быть, обратил внимание еще на два вопроса. Пандемия показала уязвимость системы здравоохранения, да и человеческой жизни в этом мире. Причем зачастую эта уязвимость, она несопоставима с тем, сколько страны тратят на здравоохранение. 17% как в США, ну или в России, если брать расходы и государства, и населения, до кризиса это было 5,6%. Сейчас, в 2020 году, за счет дополнительных мер, где-то расходы поднялись почти до 7%. Но важно не столько, сколько тратит. Мы исходим из того, что у нас система здравоохранения недофинансирования, а как больницы, клиники, вся система поддержки людей смогла сработать на и ограничение масштабов заболеваемости, и на уровень смертности. В этом смысле Россия выглядит, в общем-то, не так уж плохо на фоне и европейских стран, и других. У нас заболело где-то порядка 2,6% населения, если брать данные на начало февраля, а уровень смертности от заболевших составил 1,9%. Это ниже, чем в большинстве европейских стран. Здесь есть проблемы со статистикой, как действительно идентифицируется смертность, но я сейчас бы хотел говорить не о статистике, а в том, что, мне кажется, нам всем странам надо извлечь серьезные уроки с точки зрения того, как развивать здравоохранение, как его делать доступным, и как сделать это здравоохранение устойчивым к такого рода пандемийным шокам, от которых мы, в общем-то, за конец прошлого столетия и начало этого отвыкли. Те заболевания, там, SARS и птичьего гриппа, которые были в начале 2000-х годов, они не имели таких масштабов. Мы с пандемиями столкнулись, по сути дела, впервые. И здесь очень важно, как перестроить здравоохранение, чтобы оно стало доступным, причем для массовых слоев населения, потому что пандемия не щадит ни богатых, ни бедных. И в этой связи, мне кажется, может быть, важнейший вызов – это даже не долги, там, 200% к ВВП или, ну, в России они маленькие, но вопрос в том, а как мы можем найти ответ на эти вызовы, и не только экологические, над чем особенно активно работает Евросоюз, там, Green Deal, но как мы можем спасти человеческие жизни, потому что, по-видимому, эта пандемия и болезни – это не единственное испытание, с которым мы столкнулись. И здесь нужен обмен опытом, здесь нужны совместные усилия, кооперации, в том числе в разработке новых вакцин, и, может быть, в целом перестройке системы здравоохранения, чтобы она поддерживала иммунитет. И это целая цепочка, которая связывает здравоохранение с тем же перестройкой аграрного сектора, поскольку современное индустриальное сельское хозяйство держится на стимуляторах роста и животных, и растений, на антибиотиках, и мы подрываем свой иммунитет. Поэтому мне кажется, что вот экономика, такого нового качества здравоохранения. И в этом смысле это один из важнейших элементов перехода к устойчивому росту, может быть, к экономике, которая позволяет сберегать население, как и сберегать природу, а не только обеспечивать высокую производительность, эффективность и конкурентоспособность, к чему мы, как экономисты, привыкли. Спасибо, у меня все. Благодарю вас за внимание. Thank you very much.
Спасибо.
Thank you very much for helping us understand the perspective from Russia. And we move on to Professor Andrei Rodríguez-Pose, who is a professor of economic geography at the London School of Economics. He is probably one of the most distinguished scholars in this area. He is the past president of the Regional Science Association International. He has been advisor to numerous bodies in the European Commission, the World Bank, the OECD, etc. And he has earned some of the most important prizes and awards in this area. He is the editor of Economic Geography, which is a very important publication in this field. And as we are all used to think in terms of nation states and policy making, his presentation will illuminate to us the role of regions, cities, and the like. So, Professor Rodríguez-Pose, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Frenkel. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you at this distinguished conference. And as you have said, my intention is to talk today about the geographical implications of the pandemic, and especially not the pandemic at the moment, but what is going to happen in the post-pandemic world, because I mean, there will be an end to the pandemic. Let's hope it's sooner rather than later. And we'll have to deal with it, but we have to start preparing now. We cannot wait. So let me just share my screen with all of you to put my presentation online. And there it is. I hope you can see it. So I'm going to start by highlighting that the pandemic is having at the moment severe geographical implications. It has presented a challenge, and it's a challenge that is different from previous pandemics. I mean, COVID-19 is not the first pandemic to strike the world. There have been in the past in history bigger, more deadlier pandemics in relative terms, but also in absolute terms. And the most recent that we have had in this respect has been the first the pandemic that took place with the so-called Spanish flu about a century ago. But that was a very different pandemic because COVID-19 is very much the first one to do so, to strike the world in such a global way in what is a much more connected, digital and globalized world. And very often the big spreaders, the entry points and the diffusers of the pandemic in different countries and in different parts of the world have been the main cities. The idea that these cities are the air hubs, so the entry points for international travelers that might have gotten infected somewhere else, and then through their density, through their concentration, sheer concentration of people, have become spreaders of the pandemic within our countries, have implied that for many, cities are becoming or are facing a turning point. Over the last 3 to 4 decades across the world, what we have seen has been a massive concentration of economic activities in cities, but not just in any city, mostly in very large cities. And for many, and there have been quite a few commentators that have highlighted that this might have been the death of the large city as we know it, that in a post-pandemic world, there's going to be a more even distribution of economic activity in which there is more transfer of, more a spread of activity trying to flee these hot points of contagion. So the idea is that the pandemic might be, despite all its toll, negative toll and deadly toll, represent an opportunity for a more balanced growth in which smaller, more remote locations, even rural areas that have lost out in the past, might be offering better opportunities, not just to protect oneself from this and future pandemics, but also to attract and generate new economic activity. But one of the things that we have to highlight, and this is a map of what's happening in Western Europe at a national level, and this is from the first wave of the pandemic, the first 6 months of 2020, is that the impact of the pandemic is very uneven. Yes, there are some big cities like Milan, like Madrid, like London, like Stockholm, like Paris, that have suffered a great incidence of the pandemic. But it has also affected some areas with, let's say, medium-sized cities, smaller cities, or rural areas, like, for example, Alsace in France, or Castile-Leon, or the Northwest and the West Midlands in the UK. And when we go into more detailed analysis per region, and this is for the first 27 weeks of 2020, we see that, yes, these are in the European Union, the 6 regions that had the biggest excess mortality. And it does affect many big cities. Madrid, Lombardy with Milan, London, Catalonia with Barcelona, or Stockholm are amongst the top, together with Castilla-La Mancha, which is a region to the south and the southeast of Madrid. But not all big cities and not all regions have been affected in the same way. In fact, when we take a look at what happened within the European Union, we find that 40% of all regions during the first wave of the pandemic had less excess mortality than in previous 5 years, whereas in some others it was more than 60% in terms of excess mortality. And many big cities, like, for example, the capital city of Denmark, Copenhagen, but also Warsaw, Lisbon, Berlin, Lazio with Rome, and Campania with Naples, were highly affected by the first wave. Of course, with second and third waves, the third wave ongoing, perhaps, let's hope not, more waves, the geography is shifting all the time, but it doesn't affect all places. It is very much related to preparedness, to capacity, to react to how good your health care system, to how good your response has been. So what is this going to imply for the future geography of cities? And what I'm going to cities and regions, and what I'm going to highlight here is that there are several forces of change that are associated to the pandemic. The first one is what is known as the social scarring. What is the social scarring? Is that the pandemic is instilling psychological fear and changes in many of us. We are behaving in different ways that we did before. And some people may have enduring sort of fear of crowds and being in large groups of contact. So that might lead to a significant change. I would say that for most of us, social scarring, the fact that at the moment we are reluctant to hug other people, to go close to other people, it's probably going to fade away as soon as the pandemic goes over. But for some people, it might last, and it might have relatively enduring sort of impact. There's going to be also changes that might be somewhat longer lasting in order to maintain social distance. It's difficult to imagine that, at least in the short term, even after the pandemic is gone and infection is reduced to a minimum, or it becomes something that we can control with the vaccination that is ongoing in many countries on the world, there's going to be also changes that are going to still keep people socially distanced to a greater extent than what it was before. But probably the most important change is the forced social experiment that came with the pandemic. The idea that we had to go in Western Europe, in Wuhan, it was in January, but in Western Europe, it was in the first weeks to mid-March of 2020, we had to go into a system of lockdowns that has changed our life. Jacob Frenkel said at the beginning, well, we are having a very different type of conference. We're having a virtual conference. That probably was not something that would have imagined before, but it has changed the way we work, the way we shop, the way we interact in ways that we could have predicted beforehand. So this is not something that is completely new. These were trends that were ongoing, but we all imagine whether we're going to take years, if not decades. Well, the change took place, and it took place within days. And in many cases, we have realized that things they have changed, and they can change in radical ways and very quickly. We have changed the way we shop. It's not that online retail was non-existent before. It was important, but it has grown before, and it has grown much more over the last year. I'm going to put some examples. Even before the pandemic, in a country like Norway, retail shopping, high street retail shopping in 2019 grew by 0%. Online shopping had already grown by 40% in that very year. Now that has improved massively, or that has increased massively. People are shifting to online shopping in droves. We're changing the way we work. I am in academia, and I've been for a year now just doing lectures, much to my regret, I must admit, but it's online. Like my wife, who works for a main bank, has been working online with the exception of a few days that she has to go into the office. And of course, we are changing the way we interact and we relate to one another.
Yes,
in which we are moving towards issues like, for example, more online interaction, not just on online conferences, but also in the way we interact with friends and we meet. Maybe there's a Zoom fatigue, but Zoom and other alternatives of remote interacting are going to be here for quite some time. And this is having implications that are extremely geographical. What about changes in the way we shop? Well, changes in the way we shop are going to influence and are going to accelerate what my colleague Richard Florida was highlighting, that this is the ongoing high street apocalypse, the retail apocalypse, in which you will see that many commerces, mainly small businesses in city centers, are going to suffer. This is an image from this year in the UK, in which you can see boarded shops because clients have stayed away and they have turned massively to online shopping. It's not that after the pandemic, we're not going to go back to the office, but there's going to be a change. We have realized that we can work, and we can work in many sectors productively from a distance. So probably the return to the office is not going to be full-time, it's going to be mixed, in which in many sectors, and especially in many of those areas that have been identified as having sectors with big capacity to actually work remotely, which are mainly, again, the big cities, what we're going to see is that there are going to be mixed systems. There's going to be 20, 30, 40%, maximum 50% probably of the population in the office on any given day, which is going to have changes to, for example, how much office space we need in cities, and also is going to have changes to the way we transport, the use of public transport, etc. So there's going to be a shift in patterns in the way we work. And of course, if there's less shopping in city centers, if there's less need for office space, there's going to be changes not only to leisure and leisure activities and how we go, where we meet, whether we need to go into the center all the time for social activities, for cultural activities, but also in the need for real estate and housing space in city centers. So overall, this is going to have important impacts on territories. And what are these impacts likely to be? Well, some have predicted, as I said at the very beginning, that this is going to lead to a more even geography, that the concentration in big cities that we have seen in recent decades, especially over the last 3 to 4 decades, the winner-take-all geography of big cities and many areas lagging behind, losing out, is going to be solved as if by magic by the pandemic. That the pandemic and remote working is going to allow people to just move out of Madrid, move out of Paris, move out of Moscow, for example, and decide to go and work in other types of cities, let's say Nizhny Novgorod, for example, or even in rural areas with probably the same efficacy. The people I work with and myself, we are a bit skeptical that this is going to happen. Why? Because first, in terms of remote working, there are some areas that are highly capable or having large sectors of the population working remotely, and those tend to be the big cities. When you take a look at the list that the OECD has prepared of regions and cities that are prepared to work online, we find that the top ones are cities like London, Washington, San Francisco, Brussels, Frankfurt, which are slightly above 50%. Many regions of countries like Italy, Turkey, Greece, Spain, even where you have a concentration, you hardly go about 20%. So probably this idea that the advantages in terms of positive externalities or large pools of labor or big cities are going to disappear is probably not going to happen. Big cities, and many of them, of course, with different performances, are going to steam ahead. So the gap between big cities and medium-sized cities, towns, and especially rural areas may continue to grow. It's not that certain medium-sized cities, towns, and rural areas are not going to benefit. But in general, these are going to be those that have the greatest amenities and the easiest connectivity to large urban areas. Most other, especially rural areas, remote, isolated, with sectors that have been declining over time, probably will continue to lose out. So in that respect, it's not that we're going to have to do away with the policies to make sure that we try to promote economic development in areas that have been declining in the past, because the pandemic is not going to solve the problem. In terms of the microgeography, what happens within large urban areas, what we're going to see is a different sort of ball game. Probably in the short term, city centers are going to change. There's going to be less need for office space, there's going to be less need for commercial space, and there's going to be less need for cultural space. There's probably going to be, as a result of all that, less need in city centers, large city centers, for housing space. This might have implications for real estate prices. This might have implications for functional sort of uses. There will be probably more need for outdoor space and less need for transport, but more for alternative transports. So what we're going to see is probably a transformation of moving away at the first of heavy economic activity, so the headquarters of many firms, etc., that moving to not outside the cities, but to the suburbs of those cities, as would be a lot of commercial activity, although even commercial activity in the suburbs might suffer to online retail. And this is forcing us to rethink how our big cities and our cities will work. There are a lot of proposals. There's this whole idea, you're going to have it tomorrow, about the 15-minute city, but also we're going to have to look into open cities, more creative cities, leisure cities and how they work. We're going to have to look into new residential uses. If at the beginning, the city center suffers a slight crisis, that offers opportunities for new types of activities to come into the cities, for new types of people. There might be more emphasis on the cultural dimension of the city as a meeting point, more than the city as a center for economic activity, which can redefine the city center, but also the whole functional urban area in areas that are not less productive, but productive in a very, very different way. So when we put it all together, what we have is a situation in which the pandemic is posing a lot of challenges. The pandemic demands responses. The pandemic is accelerating in many ways transformations that were already ongoing, and we need to act. And we need to act in different ways with respect to changes between different territories, what happens. So not just make sure that we continue with policies that would maximize and tap into the potential of every territory within our countries in order to avoid not just economic waste, but also more sustainable economic, social, and environmental development, but also to make sure that the rising discontent that we have witnessed in many parts of the world doesn't become entrenched, but also we're going to have to think about more imaginative solutions in order to transform the way our cities work and then the way our cities behave, to make sure that a post-pandemic world brings not just more prosperity, but greater prosperity and well-being for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrei. This was as expected, highly illuminating. So as we travel geographically from one country to the other, we move now across the Pacific to Japan, to our very good friend and colleague, Richard Koo, who is now the chief economist of Nomura Research Institute. He has been there for a while. And the fact that we have been analyzing many of our financial crises using the language of balance sheet recession is due to his insights, first developed in the post-1990 Japanese crisis, and then applied further to the post-2007 Western economies. So thank you, Richard, for putting this concept into our intellectual terminology and concepts. Richard is a very sought after speaker. He has published many books, The Lessons from Japan's Great Recession, The Holy Grail of Macroeconomics, and more recently, The Fate of Globalization, is something that is describing his insights very well. And this is the time to ask you, Richard, who has built up his intellectual career at the University of Berkeley and then Johns Hopkins and then at the Federal Reserve, please address us on the subject. The floor is yours, 12 minutes.
Thank you very much. And so nice to be with you again, Franco, on about the same time last year. We were supposed to be meeting in Italy, but well, I had some prepared remarks, but just to comment on the previous speakers about all the changes in the cities and so forth, I happened to got stuck in Taiwan for 8 months because I went to Taiwan for business and I couldn't come back because of the suddenly Japanese government put on this massive restrictions on foreigners coming back, even for those with a permanent residency. So I was stuck there for 8 months. And I have to say that Taiwanese government did a beautiful job of containing coronavirus. In the country of 24 million people, a democratic country of 24 million people, the total number of cases is 933. Total death, only 9 in more than 1 year. So if the government does things correctly at the very beginning, a lot of the things that we are talking about now may not have to, really didn't have to happen. In the last 6 months or so that I was there, I was able to come back to Japan in October. Everything was back to normal. Restaurants crowded as ever, everything is back to normal. Of course, no international travel under the circumstances, but those countries that did very well were those ones that were affected by SARS epidemic 17 years earlier. So they learned the lesson. And so when this thing happened, they acted very, very quickly from the very beginning. And so I think that's another thing that we have to put into our calculations on how the cities may evolve and so forth. Because if they did it correctly from the very beginning, maybe many of these things could have been avoided, as Taiwanese proved, even in a democratic country. Now, let me go back to the original topic of how COVID-19 changed the world economy. I think that one of the most immediate impact of COVID-19 is that we got rid of Donald Trump. Because just a year ago, if you remember, US unemployment rate was 3.5%, the lowest in 50 years, and stock market all-time high. The guy almost looked unbeatable. But he screwed up so badly on COVID-19 that now he's gone. And that shows that this is COVID-19 doing something for the United States and for the rest of the world. But even with that, with the such lousy job of containing COVID-19, he got 74 million votes in the United States. And so that's something we have to keep in mind, that someone like that could still get 74 million votes in the United States, because that is going to be with us on the US political scene for years to come. Now, what kind of, I'm not a doctor, so I cannot tell exactly when all of these things will be over, but if the medical part of the solution is behind us, what will await us? Are we going back to the world of that existed before 2020? And the world that existed before 2020 was, as Franco just mentioned, is kind of left over from balance sheet recession, in that private sectors in all these major economies, United States, Eurozone, Japan, they were not borrowing money. They were actually saving money, even at the zero interest rates. And we never learned this in university, textbooks. Zero or negative interest rate, they should be borrowing money, not saving money. But if you can put that chart that I sent you on the exhibit 1, if that is available for people to see. Well, maybe not. Well, then I'll just give you the number. From Lehman crisis, the most recent period, so a period of over 12 years, the average savings by the private sector, so that's household sector, corporate sector, and financial sector, all taken together, they saved on average 6.5% of GDP at zero interest rates. And in the case of Japan, 8.23, in the case of Eurozone, 4.7%. They should be borrowing these numbers, not saving these numbers. It's the next page, if you can flip it. Yes, those numbers in circles, those are the taken from flow of funds data, and goes back, the part in the orange in the circled areas is the average savings of private sectors in all these economies. And these 6.54, 8.23, or 4.7, these are ridiculous numbers, absolutely ridiculous, because they're facing zero or negative interest rates. And why were they doing it? Because during the bubble days, they leveraged themselves up a lot. Once the bubble burst, asset prices collapsed, liabilities remain, they all realized that their balance sheet's underwater. The balance sheet's underwater means you have to pay down debt. And all these private sectors in advanced countries decide to do just that, increase savings, pay down debt. And once you enter that world, money really is coming back to the banking system, not leaving the banking system. And so you don't get any inflation. No matter how much money you pump into the system, it can go as far as the commercial banks, but not beyond, because it gets stuck. And in the world like this, you need fiscal policy more than monetary policy, because in a national economy, someone is saving money, someone else has to borrow money to keep the economy going. And in usual circumstances, interest rates will adjust so that you have, you make sure that savers and borrowers, they match at the end of the day. But when we have a situation like this, as I show you these numbers, when private sector is saving 6.5% of GDP at zero interest rates, the two sides are not matching. And then the government has to come in as the borrower of last resort, not lender of last resort like the central bank, but has to be a borrower of last resort to keep the economies going. And that's the world we lived in in Japan for more than 20, almost 30 years, and in United States and Europe for the last 12 years. And if we are going back to a world like this, then I don't think we will have to worry too much about inflation, because money will be mostly stuck in the financial sector. We could end up seeing some mini bubbles, and we're already seeing some mini bubbles in various asset classes. But big inflation is highly unlikely if we enter returning to that world. And there's another reason to believe that we may return to that world, because all these companies that were hurt and households that were hurt during this pandemic, they will be saying to themselves that we'll never be caught short of savings again, that we should have had more savings, because those companies that went bankrupt are the ones that didn't have enough savings. So my guess is that households will increase savings, companies will increase savings, and that will probably slow down the economy to some degree. Of course, before we get there, as soon as medical problems are over, I'm sure we're going to have 3 to 6 months of parties after parties, where everybody will come out and start spending money. But once that adjustment period is over, and then we kind of go back to a kind of a steady state world, my guess is that a lot of companies, a lot of households will be start saying, okay, let's have some savings just in case something goes wrong again. And that's against the culture, especially in the Western world of late, because when companies have a lot of savings, you know, Wall Street types, shareholders will bash them for having too much savings. That's suboptimal use of capital. You should fully invest them or give back to the shareholders. Well, those companies that listen to that kind of talk probably went bankrupt during this pandemic. And so the whole culture in the financial market could change also, that you're not supposed to borrow money to buy back your shares, you know, things like that. So those are the changes I see going forward. And one point that on a slightly longer term, the greatest story the last 30, 40 years, economic story the last 30, 40 years, I think, has been China. And in two previous crises, China helped us a lot. For example, Asian currency crisis. China did not devalue, held on, even though it was really painful for the Chinese economy, but held on, and so that Asian currency will not have to fall all that much more. And so that China played a very important role in keeping the crisis from getting worse. And after the Lehman crisis, China also did this 4 trillion yuan renminbi package, which of course, at the end of the day, turned out to be a little bigger than supposed to be, but it played a huge role in keeping many developing countries going because China kept on buying materials and so forth. But this time, we are seeing this US-China confrontation, and we are hearing this world decoupling on both sides, in Washington and in Beijing. And this is very, very worrisome, because what that means is that China really cannot play that kind of role, well, any longer. And furthermore, decoupling means not rely on foreign markets, especially Western markets. But when you look at the size of Western markets relative to the global world, and if you could change this slides to the next one, exhibit 2. The so-called Western world accounts for like 56% of world GDP, and per capita GDP is like $52,000, almost $53,000. If China removes itself from this, what's left is, of course, there'll be China, the domestic market, and what may be called a non-West market. But in both cases, per capita GDP is $10,000 or so, and it's a much more smaller market. And when I'm listening to the debate in China, I sense that they're talking about, can we make these products? Do we have all these IC chips capabilities and so forth? And it happens in many countries that politicians will talk about whether it's possible to do it, whether they can make it. But we economists should ask also whether there are someone who is willing to buy this stuff. Because too often, having capability of building them is no guarantee for economic growth. For economic growth, someone else has to buy this stuff. And I sense a similar development in Japan 30 years ago, when Japan and China had this, Japan and the United States had this horrible trade friction. And I was actually in the middle of it. The Japanese side, especially this famous mayor of Tokyo, Mr. Ishihara, who wrote this book, Japan That Can Say No, openly argued that, well, if Americans don't want to buy our IC chips, we can always sell these to the Soviets. And I'm sure they would love to buy our IC chips for their fighter planes and so forth. And he actually had quite a few followings in Japan and say, yeah, we don't have to listen to all these American demand and this and that. We can sell to the other guys. But I was on the opposite side of this debate. So I confronted Mr. Ishihara on one event and said, I'm sure a Soviet military would love to buy your Japanese IC chips. But how about the cars and appliances and all of that stuff? Japan is sending something like 1.7 million cars to the United States almost every year. But to expect Soviet Russia to buy 1.7 million Toyotas and Nissans, that's completely unattainable. And once I start making that argument, that we need markets, not just technology, but the markets for economy to move forward, a Japanese government did not listen to Ishihara's kind of argument and stayed with the US market. I see that in China, we hear a lot of talk about great circulations or double circulation and all these talks, but they seem to be too concentrated on whether they have the ability to make those goods. And of course, those are important. I mean, if you cannot produce anything, you have nothing to sell. And all these program about made in China 2025, all those things were, of course, designed to upgrade the production system in China. But from economist point of view, I really want to emphasize that markets are important. If you don't have a market, no matter how great your products are, the economy won't grow. And I hope debate in China will look into these, whether there's enough customers for what they are making so that the economy can continue to grow. Also, to reach those markets, you have to have a good relationship. And I was told that Deng Xiaoping, the one who opened the Chinese market, he did not just open the Chinese market. At that time, back in 1978, I was told that China had as many as 16 territorial disputes. Dispute with Japan, dispute with this, dispute with that. Mr. Deng Xiaoping solved 14 of them on the spot. So only 2 left. Maybe Senkaku with Japan and Taiwan, a few other issues left, but all the other ones, he resolved it. And that made everyone feeling peace with China. So all these developments started, all these companies start putting factories in China and so forth. But we see a different move now. Seems like all the territorial disputes are back on the stage again. And sometimes even with more military threats and so forth. So I really hope that at least economists in China will say, this is not where we can continue economic development, that if we continue this route, everyone will be hurt. Certainly people who depend on Chinese products abroad, but I think also Chinese themselves will see much slower growth. And that is not good for the world economy, especially when the last 40 years, the world economy depended so much on Chinese economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you already laid the ground for us transitioning into China. We are going to have several presentations emanating from scholars from China in this session and also in subsequent sessions. So this brings me now to our next speaker, and I'm cognizant of time. We will need to, in a way, start being more conscious about the time limitation. So our next speaker is Yide Qiao. He is the Vice Chairman and Secretary General of Shanghai Development Research Foundation, SDRF, and he's also the Executive Director of China International Finance Forum 30. He is coming with us with great experience. He has spent some time at the Kennedy School and then at the Harvard Institute. He has spent a lot of effort in the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences and has produced some important books about the Chinese economy in the next 30 years, which was published almost 10 years ago, and then series of more books about reform of the international monetary system, about how to rethink the international system, global financial governance. In short, he has thought about the topics that we are dealing with today. So please, it gives me privilege to ask you, Mr. Qiao, Yide, to take the floor, and please unmute yourself. Go ahead. Unmute yourself. You are unmute yourself. Can somebody in the center unmute him? At the lower corner of your screen, there is a button that you need to touch and it will be unmuting you.
Can you hear me?
Now we hear you very well.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, very good.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. Thank you for your nice introduction. Also, I'm very happy and honored to participate in the International Symposium. Particularly, I'm happy to make my presentation following Richard Koo, who did mention the case of China. So today I'm going to talk about the impact pandemic on Chinese economy from Chinese perspective. Obviously, everyone knows pandemic have a great negative impact on Chinese economy. As you know, last year, the growth, the GDP growth rate in China has been worse in past 2 or 3 decades, which is only 2.3%. But at the same time, it's the only large economy which get a positive growth rate. Not because, the reason is because the other large economy even did the worse than in China. So the reason behind that, I guess several reasons. One is China did a good job to contain pandemic. Now currently, most cases have already under control. Only sporadically some pandemic cases appear. So basically, I can say we almost come back normal business, normal life. That's I guess the major reason. Second reason, I guess, Chinese government did good job in terms of good coordination between fiscal policy and monetary policy. Last year, the Chinese central government increased the fiscal deficit from originally 2 point something to increase to 3.6%, which give a lot of incentive to local governments, to business, to individual. At the same time, of course, the PBOC, central bank, keep a good monetary policy, but still they claim the policy still are normal, not unconventionally monetary policy. That's from policy perspective. From structure perspective, I guess the export played a tremendous role to promote growth rate in China, which is unexpected at the beginning, particularly the last quarter, due to the increasing demand overseas to small electronic equipment. In this area, China have a tremendous growth of export. Another reason is the investment, particularly government investment in infrastructure, also private investment in real estate area. That's a good side. The weakness is consumption. I guess as Richard Koo mentioned, it's very strange. The saving rate everywhere increase, particularly even the interest rates are very low. I guess the reason behind that is because people worry about the possibility of future, their safety of job. They just go around the flow. They worry about what happened in future. I guess probably that's the reason behind the saving rate keep high. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Very good.
So the next year, I guess Chinese economy still will keep going according estimation of many international organizations like the World Bank and the IMF. Probably China will achieve growth rates between 7 to 8%. Of course, that depends on several factors, economic factors, whether exporters still can keep that kind of growth rate, which is uncertain. Another is if the monetary policy in United States have changing the direction, just like happened 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago, the capital will flow out of China back to the United States, which will create some uncertainty to Chinese economy. Another uncertainty is the relationship with US. As Richard Cole said, due to the pandemic, Trump is gone. But due to the pandemic, the relationship between China and the US in last year get worse from worse to worse. But now Biden administration take regime, we will see what happened in relationship between these two countries. I guess something certain, the Biden wouldn't take the same strategy as a Trump administration, but he say competition will extremely, but he doesn't want conflict. So that set a good base for improving the relationship between US and China, or put the relation on the solid base, on the rational base. I want to give some thoughts on the what Richard Koo mentioned, what happened in China. I share his opinion on the reason why China can make a great progress in economic development, make a contribution in past to a crisis. But now the Chinese governments have a little bit adjustment of development strategy. They call dual circulation. I guess we should correctly understand the slogan. Actually, from my perspective, they propose, they call dual certification, actually is defensive, not aggressive in some sense, because they worry about the US cut the relation, particularly in high-tech area. So they want to make progress in high-tech area. I can show you most Chinese economists totally agree with the point Richard Koo mentioned. China should continue and keep an open. But you can look at something happen positively. At least China, the leader of China to agree to get the carbon, low carbon. They want to get the neutral carbon in 2030, which just happened recently. They closed the deal, RCEP, with the ASEAN country. They closed the deal with the European country in a bilateral investment agreement. That position I can interpret. Chinese government still want to keep the door open. Of course, in some way, they kind of worry about, maybe too much worry about happen in some way, a colorful revolution, something happen in other countries. That's, you may argue, it's reasonable or is not reasonable. But I guess that's the whole picture. I do have some idea on reduction of pandemic negative impact on the world economy. As everybody agree, the pandemic wouldn't go away very soon. Hopefully, more people in more countries have a chance to get a vaccine. That will suppress the spread pandemic at the end. But we should reduce the negative impact during the process. I guess at some point, for example, when 30 or 40% of world population have taken vaccine, it might be a good time for every country to issue a certificate for its citizens traveling internationally. If the certificate has to be accepted by other countries, if the vaccine used to be certified by international organization like the WHO, that will be very important to give promotion to world economy. Also, as for the tension between US and China, I guess probably the competition will continue, but at least we should take more rational approach to that. Mark, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you very well.
Okay, because due to the issue involved very complicated, we should divide the issue between US China into a multiple level or multiple group. For example, the first level of issue is some issue can be coordinated between US and China, like how to deal with climate change, how to deal with the pandemic. That's the first level. Second level, both sides have to agree some debate on the issue, but both sides can solve that by compromising. The third level is both sides find cannot resolve immediately, but at least they have to have some arrangement to control these debates, not into some war, no matter hot war or cold war. That's the, I guess we can call, that's the multiple level approach to the tension between US and China. If the relationship between US and China can get on the more solid and rational base, other concern expressed by Richard Koo, I guess, can be resolved through and easily. So I just stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And this has been very illuminating, I must say. So much so that we see already that the relationships with China and the role of China in the redefinition and the redesign of the system will be very prominent on our agenda. And this brings me to our next speaker, Jacques Sapir, who has been involved in a lot of public debates. His contributions are well known, and in France, he has contributed to much of the debates at the EHESS in Paris, and subsequently he has published a lot of material. But from and he of course was awarded numerous prizes. His area is not a subject that we normally discuss in these meetings, because he's one of the great experts on the role of military, and he published quite a few books in this area. when it comes to our discussion about the redesign of the system, he was never shy in taking some views that are not always within the consensus about the role of deglobalization, about the role of the euro and how should countries maintain or exit. So I think that this is a good way to present you to our next speaker, Jacques Sapir. Please.
Thank you very much, Jacob. It's a great honor for me to attend and to make a presentation to this symposium. I will first define the context and the scope of my presentation. The COVID-19 epidemic has particularly affected the global economy, as all of us know, but most specifically, it has hit very hard the Eurozone. The second point is that the so-called second wave has created a vogue in some countries that had before very well managed the wave of spring 2020, like Germany or Portugal, by example. And I think that this is making significant contrast with East Asia, where forecasted GDP growth is probably to recover very faster than in Europe and very faster than in the EU. Then, by the way, there is still very significant difference among EU countries and among Eurozone countries, of course, and this is also a matter of concern. So the end will be, will the EU or the Eurozone is accumulating an historic lag toward Asia in the pandemic context? So the first problem is to assess the COVID-19 double shock. With the spreading of the COVID-19, the world faced a crisis without precedent. And still, the global economy is recovering very slowly, but is still recovering. And it's recovering mostly from the consequences of what could be called the Great Lockdown of March, April 2020, and in Europe, the present lockdown in most of countries. At regional level, however, the picture is quite different, mostly in Europe. The COVID-19 is making for a strong divergence at the regional level. Then let's first have a look onto the latest data which has been published by the IMF on January 21st this year. We could see, of course, that China, India too, and that's quite interesting because India has suffered most of the pandemic, and emerging and developing countries of Asia are developing now or are supposed to develop in the next 2 years very much than what is supposed to develop the Euro area and developed countries, by the way. The usual divergence in GDP growth seems to have been exacerbated by the pandemic, and the rebound slack of advanced economies is to be noted. Not surprisingly, the slack is worse for the EMU, which is not to recoup its 2018 level before 2022. So the second point is to have a look on the growth divergence in Europe, and you can see then first the amount of difference between China is emerging and developing Asia, and then countries from the Eurozone. What's more, it's very, very interesting to assess the divergence between Southern Europe, like Spain, Italy, and countries like Germany. France is probably here, given a much too optimistic you know, forecast because the expected recovery looks already blurred. And I really think that forecasts for France are probably over-optimistic. Now, what is very important is that inside Europe, the divergence between economy, the German economy, and the four other big economies, that is France, UK, Italy, and Spain, has been very heavily affected, mostly during the second wave, but too, it seems, with the first wave. Now, the industrial production and the COVID-19 impact for the first wave only because the data are not going further than August 2020. Of course, China shows the first drop, but that was to be expected because the pandemic exploded first in China. But what is very interesting is its rate of recovery, and even more when compared to other countries. One country which seems to have weathered the storm quite not better, but less bad than other countries was, of course, Russia. So China has been affected earlier than other countries. China and emerging Asia are recovering much faster. What is very important is to note that some countries like France, which brought the important support to population income, are not doing better than countries which have
global source chain, including the China part, since the arrival of international expert teams.
Than some countries which have much less supported the population. Now, have a look on the retail trade, also first wave. Retail trade statistics are quite interesting because here you can see that China had not, by the end of August of last year, recovered the shock of the pandemic. By the way, some other country had more or less recovered the shock, and Germany certainly was the country which fared the best. Now, how the European Union and the Eurozone have weathered the COVID-19 pandemic. So, as I have said, lockdowns have been implemented in different European countries, leading to different economic consequences. And what is important also to see is that the second wave of lockdown now seems to have been a bit less destructive than the first one. That's probably the learning effect of the population. You know, people have learned how to live, how to work under this lockdown situation. Also the fact that lockdown have been implemented to a lesser degree during the second wave than during the first. Here we have GDP forecast error and lockdown stringency, the comparison between Europe and other. It's quite interesting to see that some countries of Europe are not only very to the right of the curve as far as lockdown stringency, but very low for GDP forecast error. What is also striking is the situation of Taiwan. As has been said by Professor Richard Koo, Taiwan has been very less affected than other countries. And it's not, well, it's not surprising that the results have been so good, but also South Korea, Hong Kong, Russia. Japan too is not faring too bad. After that, it's quite interesting to see that the USA, at least for the first wave, because we still haven't data for the impact of the second wave, the USA at first doesn't seem to have been so much affected that other countries. Well, it's quite interesting to see that actually no Asian countries, but for India, and of course India is a very, very big country, no Asian countries had a GDP forecast error worse than 10%, when 6 European countries had one. And on the other side, if we are looking country with a GDP forecast error of less than 5%, we are to find only two European countries, Sweden and Ireland. And I'm making the guess that Ireland, with the current second wave taking place, is probably going down on this point. On the contrary, a lot of Asian countries, Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, and a country midway between Asia and Europe had one, that's Russia. An important point is that European countries have tried to protect workers, but the approach has been quite different among countries. Here you can see data for the share of employees and self-employees in monetary compensation. It's quite interesting to see that France has very much protected employees and not so much self-employees people. Actually, France is a country where the highest proportion of employees got government monetary compensation. On the contrary, Cyprus, you know, well, Cyprus is not a very big country, but Italy, and the size of the Italian GDP is not very far from the size of the French GDP, has much less protected its employees and much more protected people which were self-employed. So this graph is making very clear the difference of approach between countries on this point. Another very important point is the fact that the number of jobs which has been, the number of jobs supported by governmental measure has peaked in April with more or less 30 million of people under government support. And it's probably now going around 10 to 14 million linked to the second wave of the epidemic. Now, we have to look choice. And choice has been far-reaching. The first problem was the temporal mix of measures, that is, the balance between immediate support and the more language assistance to the economy. The second very important problem is the balance between fiscal policy and monetary policy, which was major an issue. And then we can say that if the European Central Bank provided a very effective support, mostly, but not only through the PEPP, it can be said the same from the US, with recovery plan, which has been much debate among European about the European so-called recovery plan. But you have to know that the first impact of the recovery plan are not to take place before the end of summer 2021 at best. I'm saying at best. And I'm still afraid that the first impacts are not to be felt between the end of 2021. A last problem is the fact that debt accumulation is raising the financial stability issue, with a debate taking place about a debt cancellation program. Mrs. Lagarde very firmly opposed that, but nevertheless, this is a debate taking place and public debate taking place in a lot of countries like France, also Italy, and I expect that this debate is to have very important consequences. So here you can see the difference between the support through fiscal policy and the support through a monetary policy. It's very important to say that in countries like France, Italy, Germany, most of the support was done by monetary policy. On the other side, if you are looking to countries like Austria, Greece, Ireland, but even to countries like Luxembourg, the share of the monetary policy was much less than what it was in Italy, Germany, and France. Now, the difference in recovery path in the EU and the Eurozone, while recovery in China has been faster than expected, the global economy long ascended back to pre-pandemic level of activity remain prone to setbacks. That's absolutely obvious. But it can be taken for granted that the European Union and the Eurozone have stalled in relation to the process of economic recovery in Southern Asia. And this stall is quite significant, in the fact that it could herald a form of marginalization of the EU and the Eurozone. This is what is now one of the main centers of global economic growth. The change in relative shares of the world GDP in PPP, of course, was already noticeable, of course, since the 1990s. But the COVID-19 induced a trend which largely exacerbated this situation. So the question which can be asked is, will this break, will the new break is to take place in forthcoming year? Here you have data from 1989 to 2019. Well, you can see, of course, the fall of the G7 group, the rise of emerging and developing Asia. The fact that the European Union went down to nearly, well, around 24% to around 15%, and the fact that also advanced economies like Canada, Australia, were more or less at the same level. Now, what is very interesting is the break of 2020, what you can see is the fact that emerging and developing Asia went up, and it's quite obvious because the recovery first have been less harder than European country, but also the fact that the recovery took place much earlier. But nevertheless, if we are to have some confidence in this forecast data, the share of the European Union could drop from a bit more than 15% to around 12% by 2022-2023. So, of course, this difference in the path of recovery in economic activity reflects the different strategy for supporting the economy adapted by each country. The volume of support calculated as a percentage of GDP vary widely, but there is also a clear difference between countries that support their economies through bank loans and bank shares, and those who favor budgetary and fiscal action, either through direct subsidies or through tax cuts. Industrial production share in each economy is also playing major role. Then the difference between the recovery trajectories of economic activity in developing Asia and European Union, which was already apparent before the arrival of the second wave of the epidemic. With this second wave, we will have to expect an even greater difference. So in conclusion, we'll first ask the question, is the European Monetary Union and the European Union are dropping into insignificance, into economic insignificance? Its share in the world GDP went down from nearly 24% in 1989 to probably around 12% in 2022, 2023. Second question, has the euro still grows in some of the countries that have adopted it? The economic situation of Southern Europe is clearly here a matter of concern. Look at the situation in Italy and Spain, where the situation is very bad. Look also to the situation of France. This situation, which in fact actually predates the COVID-19 epidemic, is very evident when we compare the different recovery trajectory of economic activity. And then it is clear that the COVID-19 epidemic has played the role of both revealing and accelerating change that have been noticeable for 10 years now. The shift of the world growth pole to the Atlantic, from the Atlantic zone to the Pacific zone, and more specifically to Southern Asia, seems clearly irreversible today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was very illuminating. So this brings the opening session to converge, and as I connect it to the next session, and there are some questions that have already been sent to us, but in view of the shortage of time, I recommend that we bring it up all in the discussion also of the next session, both together. One of the questions was, for example, what would be, if at all, the implications of US fiscal policy and Fed easing on future inflation? Is there a risk? Is there a danger? Where are we? And this discussion is getting heated up in the US also with interventions of Larry Summers, Janet Yellen, and I know that Mike Buchanan is very interested in this topic. So I think, and Richard Koo, I'm sure will have a say, which means I think that we will delay this issue to the next session because of time. Let me also say that when I introduced Andrei Klepach, I neglected to remind us his vast record and experience first in the National Economic Forecasting of the Russian Academy of Science, then as Director of Research Department of the Russian Central Bank, then Executive Director of the Economic Research Foundation Development Center, Head of Macroeconomic Forecasting in the Ministry of Trade, Russian Economic Development Deputy Minister. So, Mr. Klepach, we appreciate very much all the record that you brought with you to your presentation. Spasiba. I would like now to, by way of transition to the next session, only to make an observation. We have discussed a vast range of issues. We have had within few minutes from the opening up to now, interventions from France, Germany, Russia, UK, Japan, China, and I'm now talking to you from Israel. Can we speak about a disintegrated world? Whether we want it or not, we are interconnected. And then we were talking about the different records and experiences of the various countries. And geography matters a bit. Some countries have one entrance, one airport. Some countries have many, many gates. And when you are talking about lockdowns and imported viruses through travel and traffic, some countries can do it, some countries cannot do it. And why isn't it done by countries that can do it? Countries differ in terms of the authorities that government have, in terms of the political will of governments to take occasionally unpopular measures, in terms of the character of populations. I must say some countries have more obedience and more compliance in the DNA and some are not. But the DNA is not something which is genetic. It reflects national experiences. And we were told already that the experience of SARS years ago helped to understand what are the high stakes that are here. We spoke a little bit earlier about the role of science, technology, knowledge, and the message comes from the top. The US, Mexico, Brazil, there were periods at the beginning that the leaders disputed that there is an issue even, let alone seeking for solutions. So I think that the complexity is very important. And if we don't learn from each other, then we are bound to make the mistakes that others have been doing. So this is the role of these series of conferences in order to take stock and move on. And as we move on, we are now moving on with the program. And with your permission, I'm going to invite the second session to take its role. I'm going to transfer the baton to the new chair of the session, Sophia Record, Professor, Head of the Department of World Economy and International Economic Relations, St. Petersburg State University of Economics. It's a great pleasure to be chaired by you, and we will now move to the session on the BRICS. Please stay on, enjoy, and I'll ask those who administer the session to bring the next participants to the stage. Please, thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you very much. I think Sophia will be coming shortly. We will have a 10 minutes digital coffee break, and hopefully one time we will come back to the real coffee break, but 10 minutes coffee break before we start the next session on both the BRIC countries at 20, prospect for acceleration, ? That will be sharing by Sophia Record, who is the head of the Department of World Economy and International Economic Relations at the St. Petersburg State University of Economics. And I had the pleasure to work with her over the last few weeks to put together this program. So we will reconvene in 10 minutes and you can stay, take a coffee and come back within 10 minutes for the next session. Thank you. And Jacob, thank you very much. And thanks all the panelists and speakers who have participated to this, kick off and set the stage. Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Be well.
עכשיו שאלת מחקר מספר 3 והשערה. מה השאלה? מה השאלה שאתה עורך בניסוי? ומה ההשערה שלך? מה אתה חושב שיקרה? בוא נבדוק. אוקיי, אנחנו תכף נבדוק.
Okay, so shall we start this next session?
Yes, okay.
So, good afternoon, everybody. And it's a pleasure to welcome you on the second session of our virtual symposium, BRICS Countries at 20 Prospects for Acceleration. So I'm Sophia Rector from Saint-Petersburg State University of Economics, UNECON, and we have an incredible panel with speakers from all over the world. So let me briefly introduce them. Michael Buchanan, Head Portfolio Strategy and Risk Group, Macro Strategy, Temasek International Private Limited, an investment company headquartered in Singapore. Yaroslav Lisavolik, Head of the Analytical Department, Sberbank. Logan Rangasamy, Academic Director and Adjunct Professor, Wheats Business School, Johannesburg, South Africa. Nice to see you. Alexander Losev, Director General, Joint Stock Company Management Company, Sputnik Capital Management. So we are waiting for one more speaker, for David Daquey Lee. We hope that we will have him also as well as a high-profile speaker on this topic. So thank you all so much for taking the time to participate in our discussion today. So we've got 1.5 hours. You're watching us around the world, so welcome to participate. So do send questions to the chat function or questions and answers. So I'll get to them later if we will have time. So we have 2 languages in our session, Russian and English. And thanks to simultaneous translation, you may easily switch between them. So you're welcome. And so let me first start from Michael Buchanan. Mr. Buchanan, 2021 is the anniversary year for the BRIC acronym, which was introduced in November 2001, I guess, by Goldman Sachs Economic Research Group. So as far as I know, you personally worked with Jim O'Neill, Head of Global Economic Research at the time, developing the concept of BRIC as the group of fast-growing large emerging countries. But since the time, of course, this group has passed through the great evolution in different crises and also positive transformations, including establishing of the new development bank. So could you please describe your vision of BRIC economy's performance through time, taking into account new external challenges, need for the recovery growth and some structural disbalances? So please, the floor is yours, Mr. Buchanan.
Yeah, спасибо. So first of all, in terms of the original, vision of BRICS, and yes, absolutely, I was working very closely with Jim at the time, and we even put out something which I think is probably the corniest title I've ever used for one of my publications, which was called the BRIC Layer, which tried to sort of bring some of the ideas we had around just how fast demand for consumer products in particular would pick up in the BRICS. And I just remember, when we first started to do that work, and we were looking for growth in sort of mobile phone penetration of 40% and within a year or two, and people just thought those numbers were ridiculous. But of course, one of the things that very clearly played out in the BRICS economies and elsewhere was the importance of thinking about demand for things like consumer durables and so on, not with a GDP mindset where, GDP might go up, whether it's 5% or 10%, and so would demand for a product. That's not the right way to think about how these economies were changing, because demand for many key products, consumer durables, and hence some of the component inputs, grow much more, as an S-curve. In other words, if you're on a dollar a day and you double your income, you don't necessarily buy a lot more washing machines, and similarly, if you're earning $1 million a year and you double your income, maybe you don't buy that many more. There's a sweet spot, and our view was then that China was right on the cusp of that, and India was about 10 to 15 years behind. And I think in general that's sort of played out. Oh great, now you've got my presentation up. Let me go through a couple of the kind of key, more quantitative points I wanted to emphasize. I'll try and be relatively brief so we've got more time for Q&A. But one thing I think is very important is back when we first started to talk about BRICS, right on the left-hand side of this chart, the contribution to global growth in this case from China specifically, was only about 30 basis points. And so really what I want you to take away from this chart is, putting aside 2020, of course, and the COVID situation, is that even as the GDP growth rate in China has fallen dramatically from a peak of 14% with the sort of stimulus in 07, down to more like 6, the contribution to global growth from China has actually gone up. And so for many things that we care about, demand for certain commodities, for the importance of China, for the impact on other emerging markets around China, it's ever more important, even though the growth rate has obviously come down very, very significantly. And I think as this has played out, it's completely changed the nature of geopolitics as well. So more countries today have China as their main trading partner than the US, and that's a big shift. And so we would expect that to continue. Growth rate coming down, but the contribution of China to global growth remaining extremely important and just as high as before. If we go to page 2, this is very obvious stuff on page 2, but clearly as all of this has played out, you've seen this shift very strongly towards investment. Are we able to go to page 2? Well, fortunately, it is a very, there we go, terrific. So investment, of course, has grown much faster than GDP, and along with that has come a decrease in the efficiency of investment. So we're measuring that here simply by the ICOR, or incremental capital output ratio. And so you can see that, which is inverted on the right-hand side, that quite significant deterioration. Now, for a country with a very high savings rate, this doesn't create in itself a systemic risk for China, in my view, but it does have an impact on trend growth, and that's incorporated in those numbers you've seen before. Now, if we look on page 3, I think we have to address the debt issue in China. Everyone is always very obsessed about the risks from the high level of leverage in China. I've been much more relaxed about that structurally, but we have, of course, seen a sharp jump after some years of stabilization with the response to COVID. That's true absolutely everywhere, and I think actually in China, these moves are relatively manageable and do not in themselves create a systemic risk. But how this plays out as we look on page 4 is going to be quite important. And we are seeing, I think, quite a meaningful shift at the moment. So on page 4, if that can come up, what you're seeing is an adjustment in terms of where the sort of the pain is on the debt side and the default side. So until very recently, well, first of all, of course, there are very few defaults. That's a defining characteristic, but almost all of them were private enterprises. Whereas you're seeing a little bit of a shift towards SOE defaults, which you can see in the blue bars on the left. And so that's something that is actually a good thing, but it's something that we'll be watching quite closely just to make sure that that plays out in a smooth fashion. That would certainly be our expectation. But given what's happening with monetary policy, which I'll come back to, that will be quite an important aspect of how China manages this transition. Or in fact, maybe just to sort of touch on the monetary policy side of it here. Just in the most recent statements that we've had from policymakers in China, there's just a little bit of a hint towards a tightening of policy. They're focused now a little bit more on avoiding sort of building in systemic risks into the financial system, and also on kind of creating room for future monetary policy easing should that be necessary. And that just sort of sends a little bit of a signal that policy might be a touch tighter going forward. And the growth GDP growth targets look very low to us. Policymakers are talking about 6%. We would see Chinese growth in 2021 at more like 8%, even if they do very little on the policy side. Now, On page 5, you know, obviously the share of household income as a percentage of GDP has gone down, and the share of consumption remains very low in China today. But that said, you know, you have had, as you can see in the orange bars on the left, you've had very significant compounded growth in consumption. It's just been a little bit less dramatic than the rest of the economy. And the point I would make here, and this is something I think we all need to watch carefully going forward in China, is that in the past, you know, it was always easy to say, well, the household sector has so much room to grow, there's so little leverage. If anything goes wrong, we can just, you know, lever up the consumer. That's no longer the case. Mortgage debt and some other consumer debt has risen relatively significantly now in China. And so that room that was always there before is much less true now. On page 6, on the left-hand side, you can see the aging of the population. We all know this, I won't go through that, but clearly China is aging significantly. But then when you look at you know, the education level for workers, I think here there's a you know, quite an interesting opportunity. This is a space that, you know, for example, we at Temasek are very focused on to invest in education sector in China, both in terms of you know, primary, secondary education, but also sort of tertiary qualifications, retraining, and so on. There's a lot of opportunity there to continue China's build up the sort of value added curve that we've already seen significantly. On page 7, just briefly on in terms of these SOE reforms and the sort of tighter sort of budget for SOEs, of course, that's going to lead to an exit of non-viable firms. I won't take you through all of this given the time, but what I would focus on is right at the bottom, the kind of fiscal reforms that are going to be necessary to manage this process. There's going to need to be a greater flow of fiscal resources to some of the poorer regions, and also a shift in the nature of local government revenues towards more sustainable revenue, like property taxes, rather than very, very cyclical things like property sales, for example. So again, that's something that we believe is happening that will make the China story more sustainable and continue this, you know, quite extraordinary rise that we've seen in China. Given the time, I'll just be very, very brief on the other BRICS. So on page 8, you know, we can see obviously since the original work, we've had very, very strong but slowing growth in India, Russia, and Brazil. On page 9, a key point I would make here is that obviously the savings rate situation is very different in these other BRICS. That creates a much greater limit to the investment growth that we can expect. And particularly as the earlier commodity super cycle unwound, you know, that limited the growth potential and also led to some currency weakness. Given the time, let me just jump to slide 12, because you know, one good thing for actually many emerging markets, but including Brazil, India, and Russia, is that in the past, you know, we always worried that whenever there's a bit of a risk-off event, currencies will depreciate. The pass-through from depreciation to inflation is very high. And so, you know, central banks would be forced into a pro-cyclical tightening of monetary policy, which would be very, very difficult. That's much less true. First of all, inflation rates everywhere are low, although obviously some and others would argue that there are some risks there, but we would expect that to continue for the foreseeable future. And pass-through from depreciation has fallen pretty much everywhere. And that gives monetary policy much greater flexibility in all of these markets, and also allows the countries to use the exchange rates much more as a shock absorber, which is exactly what you want them to be able to do. And that makes, again, the sort of growth story a little more sustainable. So finally, on the last page, the external imbalances and reserve adequacy numbers have improved. That's especially true for Russia, but for many of these markets. And so overall, as we look at all of these countries, we're still very positive structurally on the BRICS. I'd say in terms of our shorter term views, I'd make a little bit of a distinction right now and say, you know, China has had a fantastic run. Policy, you know, it dealt with the COVID situation arguably much faster, and also had very accommodating policy settings. Those settings are now just starting to be tightened a little bit, and markets have run up. So we would be a little less excited right now, but the structural story in China is still fantastic. Whereas the other emerging markets, we would still retain a tactical sort of positive on. But just one last point to close on in terms of, you know, really the big picture, longer term sort of outlook for, in particular, China. I think there's still a tendency among, you know, many people in the West to sort of think of China as being a brilliant copycat producer. And that is just absolutely not the case in so many areas. And I don't just mean in sort of, you know, producing goods, but in terms of life sciences, for example. There really is some amazing innovation going on in China, and that's a space that we love, and I think is testament to the shift in the nature of the growth story in China, very much moving up the value-added curve. So let me leave it there, and we can cover more stuff in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Buchanan, for this very detailed view of the structural features of BRIC countries and its evolution. And we see this combination of external uncertainties and shocks, and this need for some reforms, and structural reforms for either developed or developing countries anyway. And BRICS economies are also on this playground, so to say. So I see that Professor Lee has joined us. Yes, could you please say something?
Yes, I am here. Yes, I'm here. Yes.
Very good, very good, very nice. So if you don't mind, the next question will be to you, Professor Lee. Okay, so I would love to turn to the issue of the main authority, actually, of BRIC countries, which actually makes this this group a real institution. So it institutionalizes the group of BRICS. So and this is a new development bank. So could you comment on the activities of the new development bank and how you see maybe the prospects of the development of joint investment projects, maybe infrastructural projects between the BRICS countries, given that this factor is a great indicator of economic cooperation within the group? And maybe could you describe these prospects of joint investment activities within the new development bank in general, if you don't mind?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here. Thank you, and thank Marc Uzan, my longtime friend, for inviting me. And here we're discussing a very important topic, the BRICS and 20 years. And among the initiatives of the BRICS countries, the New Development Bank definitely is one of the outstanding new initiatives. And it's been running for almost over 5 years now, over 5 years. And the NDB has made a few progress in the following areas. Number one, the NDB has been having the fastest pace of investment among new multinational development agencies, and is actually running at a faster pace than another institution which was set up at the same time, which is the ARIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The NDB is running faster than that. And also the NDB has been, I would argue, that more innovative than all the peer institutions set up around about 5 years ago. I myself, I worked at the NDB as the chief economist until last May, and so I witnessed the innovation. Okay, so what are the innovations the NDB has been doing? The first one is to do a local currency lending. Okay, so a certain degree, a certain proportion of the loans were made in local currency. That is, for example, to do Russian projects in Russian ruble, in the Indian projects in Indian rupee. Why this is important? This is important. Number one is to greatly mitigate the exchange rate risks of the borrowing countries. And because until now, almost all international agencies have been lending out in the US dollar, okay? So imposing foreign exchange risk upon borrowing countries. And also, this is also important because the other side of the lending is the borrowing of the NDB. The NDB has been issuing debt in local currencies. For example, issuing debt in China, in RMB. Okay, so this is able to help NDB to diversify its source of funding. Okay, so this is super important. And another innovation the NDB has been doing is called the low country practice. That is to impose an overall standard of projects. However, it does not impose very specific things on the project. So I use the metaphor of gymnastics. You know, in gymnastics, you have required programs, you have your freestyle programs. So so far in almost all international lending agencies like the World Bank, all of their lending are like required programs. Like in gymnastics, right? You are required to perform certain moves. Okay, individual players does not have the room to do their own maneuver. Okay, but with NDB encourages individual countries to have a certain degree of freedom to do their own projects. For example, very specific, procurement standard. So let me give a hypothetical example. If Russia has a program in, for example, subway construction, borrowing money from the New Development Bank. Okay, now in the old practice, Russia has to follow the standard of procurement of the steel, of construction material, according to a very rigid standard, which is extremely burdensome, also very costly. But NDB says that, well, Russia can do your own procurement procedure so long as you follow 1, 2, 3 principles, like clean, transparent, and like anti-corruption, so on and so forth. So this greatly enhanced the efficiency of lending. And another thing that NDB has been doing, okay, I wouldn't say it has achieved major progress yet, but it's definitely making good progress. That is, the NDB has been pushing for its own research agenda. Okay, the NDB has a very important function in producing policy proposals, in publishing reports. Until now, the World Bank's, the international monetary funds, have been publishing very influential reports, and these reports mostly reflect perspectives of major Western countries, like the US, okay, lacking the perspectives of emerging market economies. But NDB has been publishing its own reports reflecting the perspectives and also the standards and also the policy thinking of BRICS countries. This is extremely important. Now, next step. Let me finish with after this one. Okay. Next step is NDB is now expanding its membership. Why expanding membership? Because the NDB wants its members to be diversified, not only from the BRICS countries, but also countries from other regions, in order to stabilize the funding. Okay, the stabilized portfolio, the diversified portfolio, to make sure the financing is more stable. Also, this way, the NDB is more inclusive, is more diversified in its policy perspectives. So let me end here. In summary, I strongly believe, as a former employer of the NDB, I strongly believe NDB is one of the highlights of the BRICS collaboration. Okay, every year BRICS leaders come together, and the NDB the president of NDB makes report to the 5 countries leaders. Okay, so I am very enthusiastic with NDB, even though I'm no longer working for the NDB. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. So you paid attention to the role of also of NDB in de-dollarization, so to say, and this diversification of currency flows. So it's a kind of a anti-crisis role, so to say, of the mechanism of NDB as well. So this diversification, and also I noticed this innovative role of NDB as well. Could you just answer some small additional question from me, because I'm very much interested in whether bank still develops joint investment projects in its portfolio. I guess it's the crucial criterion of the development bank as it is. So not just financing projects of each country separately, but joint initiatives or joint projects. Do you examine the development of this kind of projects within the NDB portfolio? What do you say?
Yes, my understanding is the NDB is working very hard exploring this kind of projects. And notice that the NDB, number one, does have the intention to enhance more collaboration across countries, especially across member countries. And number two, because of the so-called country standard rather than international standard, this would allow more cross-country collaborations. When I left NDB, the NDB was doing research on issues like collaboration between NDB and the sovereign countries' development banks. For example, in Russia, you have your own state development bank, right? And NDB would jointly work with them. So yes, indeed, the NDB is working on that, and I am hopeful, and also I'm confident NDB will have collaborative projects across countries before long.
Sorry, Sophia, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I didn't switched on the microphone. Thank you very much, Professor Lee, for your input. And I'd love to give the floor to Mr. Lisavolek. And my question is, as far as we know, in 2020, Russia chaired BRICS, and also a new strategy of economic development was also adopted. So given this multiple uncertainties of the modern world economy and this this monocurrency in the world, still do you see some anti-crisis role of BRICS countries nowadays? So how do you see this? Could you please comment?
Yes, thank you very much, Sophia, and thank you very much for this opportunity to present to you my views on this subject. I think the anti-crisis role is precisely what needs to be at the center of discussions in the coming year and possibly even further, because this is an unprecedented crisis that calls for a very concerted response from the largest developing economies, from the BRICS economies. And in discussing this anti-crisis response, I think one theme that is, in my view, very important to note is that as BRICS turn 20, I think they're grown up enough to try to deliver an anti-crisis response that is not just confined to themselves. Instead of being introverts, they need to become extroverts in a significant way, and to look at the possibility of delivering growth impulses, anti-crisis responses beyond the BRICS perimeter to a wider range of countries. And this in turn is possible, I think, because there are mechanisms, there are institutions that allow for such a transmission mechanism to take place from the BRICS economies to other developing countries, most notably with respect to their regional partners. Every BRICS economy is a central pillar within a certain region of the developing world, whether it's Russia and the Eurasian region, whether it's Brazil and Latin America, South Africa and Africa, etc. And there are regional integration arrangements, there are regional development banks, there are regional financing arrangements already in existence where BRICS countries are members, and these institutions, these instruments can be used in order to deliver this growth impulse, these anti-crisis impulses coming from the BRICS economies to their regional partners. And I think this vision of how the anti-crisis measures of the BRICS economies can redound to the global economy. It can be taken to yet a higher level, to a global level of sorts. I think what the BRICS countries can look at is the possibility of combining their regional integration arrangements, their regional development institutions, and their regional financing arrangements into platforms that can target certain key priorities, anti-crisis priorities for the developing world and the global economy more generally. So if we're talking about trade, then the respective regional trade arrangements where BRICS countries are members can cooperate together with the World Trade Organization in matters that have to do with reducing trade barriers, including with respect to critical items such as medicine, medical equipment, etc. If we're talking about connectivity, if we're talking about infrastructure, then it's about the platform of the regional development banks where BRICS countries are members, where they can cooperate. And NDB, the new development bank, can play a coordinating role. And of course, the World Bank at the global level can play a coordinating role there in promoting this cooperation amongst regional development banks. And building portfolios, anti-crisis portfolios of the respective projects. And then, of course, we're talking about the macroeconomic stabilization mechanisms. And in this regard, the respective regional financing arrangements where BRICS countries are members can play a role, and they can cooperate in that regard with the BRICS CRA and with the International Monetary Fund. In fact, some of these platforms are already in existence. The World Bank has created a platform for regional development banks to look into issues of cooperation in matters such as migration. And the IMF for several years now has been conducting regular coordination activities with the respective RFAs, regional financing arrangements, that target themes such as monitoring the state of the regional economy, the state of the global economy, and cooperation between regional institutions and global institutions such as the IMF. Then there's, of course, on top of all of these issues that I've just mentioned, the regional, the global, another aspect to the global agenda is the G20, where BRICS countries, of course, all BRICS countries are are members, and this is a very important forum where key priorities of anti-crisis policies are being discussed. And of course, there is a role for the BRICS to have more of a coordination in these discussions. Probably there may be a need to speak with more of a unified voice on issues such as the needs of the least developed economies. This is something that I think still needs probably further joint work. And of course, another theme that has to do with anti-crisis response coming from the BRICS is what my Chinese colleague has also already mentioned, the issue of the expansion of the new development bank, and accordingly the delivery of these growth impulses and the implementation of projects across a wider range of developing economies. I think it's only natural for the new members to be selected from amongst the regional partners of the respective BRICS countries in order to facilitate the connectivity projects that may be then financed through NDB loans. Generally, I think when we're talking about the anti-crisis response, there needs to be more of a coordination for BRICS economies, not just amongst themselves, but also with their respective regional partners and the respective regional institutions. This is a tremendous resource that so far is underutilized, severely underutilized in the global economy. Suffice it to say that the resources of the respective regional development banks are larger than those of the World Bank, and those of the regional financing arrangements rival that of the resources of the IMF. So this is something to look into, particularly as in the past several years, the BRICS has been looking into the possibility of strengthening this cooperation with the respective regional institutions in which BRICS countries are members. Now, another theme that I think is very important is the positioning of BRICS in the post-COVID world. I think certainly reforming global governance, reforming global institutions, and most notably, the reform of the WTO is a key issue here. I think one of the things that the BRICS can do, and I'm surprised they haven't done this so far, is to create a unified bloc within the WTO, because after Russia joined the WTO, all countries, all BRICS economies are part of the WTO. They can create a bloc that pursues key trade priorities in the global economy. Another theme is the positioning that has to do with greater inclusivity and greater openness of the BRICS. And I think in this regard, the pursuit of the BRICS Plus format that was launched by China back in 2017 is very promising and should be most likely actively pursued by China next year when it assumes yet again the presidency within BRICS. And then I think it's also about a different model for economic development, something that has been mentioned by the previous speakers in the previous panel, namely a model of economic development that is more geared towards human capital development, most notably healthcare and education, something that incorporates, a model that incorporates to a greater degree environmental standards, sustainability considerations, and ESG standards. And of course, another theme is related to that, related to this different model for economic development, is more balanced growth, lower inequality. The BRICS economies are currently, and for quite some time, have been amongst the countries with some of the highest levels of economic inequality, not just in terms of income, but in terms of cross-regional, intra-country, cross-regional differences. And I think to conclude, the BRICS need to deliver something more proactive. I think they shouldn't wait for the developed world or for the global institutions to deliver their own vision, to deliver their own panacea. And I think coming up with proactive solutions, like, for example, an anti-crisis policy framework. In case there's another wave of crisis, how do we respond? How does this coordination take place across BRICS countries and also in terms of the cooperation with regional partners? This is something that needs to be given significant consideration. And then there's, of course, also the need for greater innovation. Something that Mr. Buchanan talked about when he concluded his speech on China. I think we're starting to see more of that there's less imitation, more innovation. And this has to be, I think, the cornerstone of the new institutions, such as the new development bank and the new policies and new approaches coming from the BRICS. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Lezovolik. So you've created really anti-crisis agent for BRICS countries now. So of course we're living in, so to say, multifaceted world. So it's some kind of a network of networks. So as far as I understood, what you suggest is BRICS plus open formats, yes, and some hybrid systems for development, not to be so narrow-minded when we create just one format and they often compete with each other. So I think it's a very positive way of development nowadays. So we've discussed some stabilization mechanisms within BRICS, including NDB, but we have one more very important mechanism that shows that BRICS is rather mature structure, and also that countries are developing their coordination also in financial and monetary sphere. So I'd love to turn to Professor Angozami. So let me ask you a question, given your previous expertise in South African Reserve Bank. So it can be argued that during the period of its development, the BRICS group has shown significant progress in overall coordination and coordination of interaction, including such mechanism as a pool of conventional currency reserves. We cannot forget about that. So how do you assess the sense and the role of this contingency reserve arrangement in the financial coordination within BRICS, and as a message for the international financial system? Because of course, we read many analysts that argue that this step may show the intention to create an alternative to the two institutions of the Bretton Woods system, the IMF and the World Bank, the effectiveness of which is increasingly now more or less in doubt. So what is your opinion about that?
Yeah, no, thank you, Sophia. I really appreciate the kind introduction and welcome. A very good afternoon from sunny South Africa. It's just past 12 a.m., 12:44 to be more precise. It's an extremely warm day here in South Africa. Temperatures around 30 degrees Celsius. I thought I'll just throw that in for our European colleagues like Marc, etc., who's wearing all these warm clothes. However, having said that, apart from the weather, we've got our fair share of problems here. You know, growth is low, unemployment, etc. And as you may have heard, that South Africa is currently in the news as far as the vaccines are concerned. We've procured 1 million doses. It's landed in the country, and we've just found out that the doses we've procured is not going to be ineffective in terms of the new strain we have here. So we still have a lot more work to do in terms of tackling the pandemic. Let me start off by expressing my gratitude to the organizers for the invite to the symposium. I want to further state how honored and privileged I am to be part of this distinguished panel. Now, just a few introductory remarks, which covers some of the issues and topics that we have addressed earlier on. On the 27th of November, 2011, the Financial Times published an article entitled, "It's Time to Bid Farewell to the BRICS." Now, the author was Philip Stevens, who argued that the BRICS grouping was heterogeneous, right, with economic, political, and other considerations making these countries what he termed uncomfortable bedfellows. Some 1.5 years later, to be more precise, on the 27th of March 2013, the BRICS leaders announced plans to establish the new development bank and the contingent reserve arrangements, the CRA, as it is more commonly known in BRICS circles. Now, according to the leaders' statement that they issued in 2013, the new development bank was meant to mobilize resources for infrastructure and sustainable development projects in BRICS and other emerging and developing countries. And it was also meant to complement the efforts of the multilateral and regional financial institutions in support of global growth and development. The CRA, or the contingent reserve arrangements, on the other hand, was meant to assist in addressing short-term balance of payments pressures in BRICS countries. However, there probably still is, much skepticism about the BRICS as a grouping. According to, on 3rd April 2013, a Harvard professor, Joseph Nair, wrote in an article that he entitled BRICS Without Mortar. So this is 1 month after the leaders issued the statement about the new development bank and the CRA. So Professor Nair, wrote this article entitled BRICS Without Mortar. This article was published in Project Syndicate. His arguments were very similar to what were expressed in the Financial Times article some 2 years ago. So according to Professor Nair, the BRICS grouping was best suited to coordinating what he termed diplomatic tactics, rather than serving any meaningful purpose to advance the group as an economic powerhouse on the global stage. Now, fast forward some 6 years later to currently where we stand, the new development bank and the CRA have been established and have become operational. These two initiatives are often cited as the success stories of the BRICS, and particularly in BRICS circles themselves. The new development bank, we've already had David, speak about that. So I'm now going to concentrate and move on to look at, the issue of the CRA. But before I look at that, the issue of whether the BRICS has been successful or not, right, depends on the counterfactual. Many critics have cited that the BRICS grouping was and is not optimal. There have been arguments that other emerging economies like Mexico, South Korea, etc., should have been included in the group. However, it is very difficult to say whether such a group consisting of these additional members would have been more successful. So while the question, and this is the point that I want to make, while the question of the composition of the BRICS group is interesting, the usefulness of this question beyond academic analysis, I think, is somewhat doubtful. Rather, it is more fruitful to consider the achievements of the BRICS today than to debate whether the group's composition is appropriate or not. Despite the tensions that currently prevail, and there are many within the group, political and otherwise, there is no indication that the political will to maintain the BRICS as a group is waning. Now, this does not mean that the BRICS collaboration and cooperation to date has been optimal. In fairness, the answer is probably not. It hasn't been optimal. In fact, there are instances where differences of opinions among the BRICS members have prevented them from speaking with a united voice in international fora. And Yaroslav, made mention of this as a shortcoming, that, we don't see the BRICS speaking as a united voice in some of these international forums, G20, IMF, WTO, probably to the extent that they should. Right. And if you want me to cite a couple of examples, I think as far as differences are concerned, the IMF quota reform issue is probably a classic example of where BRICS countries have different opinions on the way forward. However, having said that, there is definitely room for more enhanced collaboration amongst members of the groups, particularly on issues of mutual benefit, such as intra-BRICS trade, capital flows, etc., etc. However, as mentioned earlier, CRA is often cited as one of the success stories of the BRICS. This initiative features quite prominently in statements released at the annual BRICS Leaders Summit. So let me now move on to look at the BRICS contingent reserve arrangement more specifically, and that's a question, Sophia, you posed to me. The BRICS CRA, or the contingent reserve arrangement, provides financial support through liquidity and precautionary instruments to address actual or potential short-term balance of payments pressures in BRICS country. It's a $100 billion facility and became effective in 2015. Let me provide 4 points in my assessment of the CRA. Firstly, the facility offers protection or insurance against global liquidity pressures, mainly dollar pressure. It is a facility that offers short-term assistance during periods of financial stress. Now, having an insurance or an insurance mechanism that offers financial assistance during periods of stress is something that policymakers around the world will welcome as part of their toolkit. This certainly holds true for the BRICS as far as it pertains to the CRA. Secondly, the CRA forms a vital part of the global financial safety net for the BRICS countries. As is well known, the global financial safety net has been described as patchy, uneven, unequal, and this is certainly the case for some of the BRICS countries. For example, South Africa's capital contribution under the CRA or to the CRA is $5 billion US dollars. But South Africa has access to a potential $10 billion under the facility. Now, this $10 billion is quite significant when you consider that South Africa's reserves amount to only approximately $50 billion. So it's almost 20% of our reserves. In fact, if you look at the CRA makes up 13% of the global financial safety net for South Africa. And if you exclude the reserves, and the global financial safety net as reserves, bilateral swap lines, regional financing arrangements, and IMF facility, if you take out reserves, the CRA accounts for 43% of South Africa's GFSN. So that's quite significant. However, it is not clear to what extent a country's access to the GFSN is taken into account when the IMF, does its adequacy of reserve, assessment for the country. Now, this is an important issue as it has significant implications, and this is something that we argued in South Africa. You should be taking account of these things, simply because the amount of reserves a country holds affects investor perceptions, as implications for exchange rate movements, etc., as everyone knows. Now, this issue that I've just highlighted here is an important issue for a country like South Africa, which is a small open economy and is significantly constrained in its ability to accumulate additional reserves. So what we've been arguing for in South Africa here is, rather than go for accumulating reserves, what we should be doing is looking at the other layers of the GFSN, because it's much more cheaper to have, and we can access those resources whenever we have problems and difficulty. And the CRA is basically one such facility that allows for this. The third point that I'd like to make, Sophia, relates to the operationality of the facility. The CRA features quite prominently on the work program of the BRICS central banks. Every year, a test run is undertaken to improve the operations of the facility. However, having said that, to date, only the de-linked portion of the scheme has been tested. The linked portion of the facility, which is tied to an IMF program, incidentally, makes up 70% of the facility. But this portion has not been tested. So what you have here, in effect, is a facility, right, that only makes available 30% of the funds currently, right? So there is some room to go as far as ensuring that the full 100 billion is available. Now, this is something that lies on the agenda of the central banks, and they're working towards this. And in fact, even with the IMF, there has been moves to for the IMF to enhance its cooperations with the RFAs. And the CRA is very much part of that process. Fourthly, as far as the CRA is concerned, closer collaboration or cooperation between the CRA and other RFAs, particularly the Shanghai initiative, I think is something that should be actively and aggressively explored. This would not only enhance South-South cooperation and collaboration, but would also be very beneficial for the CRA, particularly in terms of the availability of funds, and it could also assist the CRA in terms of improving the operations of the facility. And Sophia, let me move on to the second question, that you raised. Basically, the issue related to whether this is an alternative to the two institutions of the Bretton Woods system and the IMF and the World Bank, and make some comments about the effectiveness, of these IFIs. Once again, let me make 4 points and try and be a little bit more focused and direct in addressing this question. The first one relates to governance issues. There is little doubt that governance issues at the international financial institutions have become a hindrance to the execution of quick and adequate responses to strains in the global financial system. The quota-based system of the IFIs in particular is something that is quite well known and is an issue that warrants particular attention. In a world where emerging market economies account for over 40% of world GDP at market rates, and almost 2/3, if not higher, of world growth currently, it is to the detriment of the world economy, not to the emerging economies alone, but to the world economy, if the voice and needs of emerging markets economies and developing economies are ignored or not adequately catered for. If we continue in the route that we are moving, we're going to end up eventually in a polarized world. And that, I think, is something that we need to address quite aggressively, in the international forum. Secondly, the potential benefits to be derived by improving cooperation and collaboration among the IFIs, including the institutions other than the World Bank and the IMF that you've highlighted there, Sophia, is without question. Enhanced collaboration would certainly result in economies of scale and scope. The issue of enhancing cooperation and collaboration is something that has been and continues to feature on the agenda as far as international fora is concerned. I was involved, in these international fora for the past 6-7 years, and it's been on the international fora for those 6 or 7 years. And I think the progress has been pretty slow in many respects. This feature also, this issue also featured quite prominently, by the way, in the report of the G20 Eminent Persons Group on global financial governance. This is something that we need to address, quite urgently and forcefully. The third point, colleagues, regional financing agreements and other regional arrangements are in fact a result of the shortcomings of the workings of the IFIs and the international financial architecture. I think in many respects, what you have, evolving over time has been a direct result of the shortcomings, of the IFIs in addressing specific needs, particularly as they pertain to emerging and developing countries. I do not think that the the regional financing arrangements were meant to create, as you would put it, or as you put it, an alternative to the two institutions of the Bretton Woods system. Rather, the CRA, for argument's sake, was meant to address more specifically some of the shortcomings in the prevailing international financial architecture. Finally, this is a point that I'd like to leave you with. It's quite interesting to note that the CRA resembles the IMF's quota-based voting for operational decisions. However, having said that, the CRA gives BRICS members a greater say when compared to IMF processes, in the sense that no single party, has a veto position. This is definitely a step, in the right direction. Of greater concern, however, having said that, is that the IMF linked portion of the CRA relates to the IMF linked portion of the CRA. What this in effect means, as I pointed out earlier, is that 70% of the CRA funds is tied to IMF processes or an IMF fund. This somewhat undermines the CRA's significance, improving its surveillance capacity, and I think also giving some attention to its legal status will enhance the benefits of the CRA. And I think this is an issue that the BRICS stakeholders should actively engage in. Thank you, Sophia. Let me leave it there.
Thank you so much, Professor Rangasamy, because you've touched not only this particular issue that I asked you, but also the whole picture of positioning of BRICS in the world. And one of the core questions, whether it's just a group of economists, emerging economists, that it was announced 20 years ago, or it's just some kind of already some grouping that is coordinating its efforts and also developing and how to recapitalize this format, actually, how to make it more and more productive. So maybe my finalizing question will be in this case to Alexander Losев, and now I'll switch into Russian, if you do not mind. Александр Вячеславович, учитывая вот такую взаимосвязанность экономических субъектов глобальной экономики и такую растущую скорость передачи данных и, соответственно, передачи признаков рецессии в мире, как вы оцениваете роль экономик стран БРИКС в финансовой стабилизации? Мы продолжаем этот вопрос, в том числе за счет развития новых технологий и движения к мультивалютной финансовой системе.
Уважаемая Софья, дорогие коллеги, благодарю за приглашение выступить на симпозиуме. И вот прежде чем касаться вопросов БРИКС, давайте поймем главную проблему современного мира, что распределение денежных средств и потоков капитала в мире обусловлено поведением одной резервной валюты – доллара. И именно это, то, что доллар является доминирующей валютой, ставит все рынки, и глобальные, и региональные, в зависимости от изменения монетарной политики США, там, ФРС или правительства США, в зависимости от американской экономики. И мы видели прекрасно, что творилось в 2008 году, что происходило в прошлом году, что все кризисы и потрясения, которые происходят на Уолл-стрит, так или иначе приводят к изменению объемов производства товаров и услуг в реальной экономике всего остального мира. И мы видим, что доминирование доллара в международных расчетах является основной причиной дисбаланса, потому что в существующей модели мировой экономики, такой доллароцентричной, для поддержания глобальной платежеспособности Соединенным Штатам необходимо экспортировать доллар во внешний мир. Через что? Через торговлю, да, и имея отрицательное сальдо торгового баланса, и возвращать обратно через рынок капитала. Если Соединенные Штаты начинают бороться с отрицательным сальдом торгового баланса, если появляются такие вещи, как торговые войны, тарифные войны, протекционизм, то, соответственно, это вредит мировой торговле, это вредит развитию всего остального мира, прежде всего развивающимся экономикам. И, кроме того, более трети долгов за пределами США номинированы в долларах. Да, и когда мы видим, что мир пытается выйти из состояния рецессии, миру нужны новые средства для того, чтобы иметь источники инвестиций, для того, чтобы выводить свои экономики из рецессии, то так или иначе миру придется либо обслуживать эти долги долларовые, либо замещать доллары на какие-то собственные валюты. И мы видим, что колоссальная долларовая эмиссия, а по данным МВФ объемы помощи в прошлом году составили 14 триллионов долларов, да, вот эта колоссальная долларовая эмиссия усиливает риск будущей инфляции и риски валютных войн. И мы видим также, что кризисы приводят к замедлению международной торговли и к падению сырьевых цен. И мы видим, как дефицит долларов для внешних рынков создавал проблемы прошлой весной. Соответственно, то, что очевидно, что нам необходимо менять что-то в этой системе. Кроме того, мы с таким нескрываемым, такой тревогой наблюдаем, что Соединенные Штаты увлекаются санкциями и использованием собственного законодательства как оружие. И это дополнительные риски для мировой экономики и для развития многих регионов. Поэтому становится очевидно, что вот мы вошли в новое десятилетие, которое может характеризоваться хаосом, может принести много неприятных сюрпризов. И мы видим, что экономика, мировая экономика движется от всеобщей глобализации к структуре больших пространств. И правила, возможно, в новом десятилетии будут определять ведущие региональные державы, то есть не США как гегемон, да, там гегемония заканчивается, а региональные державы, к числу которых относятся, конечно, Китай, Бразилия, Индия, Россия и Южная Африка. То есть государства БРИКС для того, чтобы не опасаться экономических кризисов и санкций, в том числе вторичных со стороны США, для того, чтобы обеспечить рост своих экономик, концентрацию капиталов, ресурсов, производственных мощностей, так или иначе придется поддерживать формальные или неформальные торгово-экономические союзы и использовать собственную валюту для взаимных расчетов. Без этого мировую экономику ждет длительная стагнация, возможно, рост инфляции и все скатывания в мировой финансовый кризис, который может возникнуть из-за долгового кризиса. Объем долгов в мире сейчас достиг отметки 280 триллионов долларов. Это очень много, и не случайно и МВФ, и Всемирный банк, и группа 30 предупреждают о том, что волны накопления долга всегда приводили к финансовым кризисам. И ожидая таких проблем, ожидая, что кризис затронет все без исключения страны мира, здравый смысл подсказывает необходимость создания региональных платежных систем, укрепления экономик, создания технологий в странах, которые сейчас называются развивающимися, да, развитие поддержания цифровых технологий. И мы видим, что и Россия, и Китай, и Евросоюз строят свои альтернативные платежные системы. И мы можем только приветствовать стремление Китая стать мировым лидером в области финансовых технологий. И то, что Народный банк Китая разрабатывает цифровую версию юаня, и, возможно, это будет валюта международных расчетов, дает такой прекрасный пример и для России, где Центральный банк тоже рассказал о том, что будет вводиться цифровой рубль, и для остальных стран БРИКС, прекрасный пример, как можно с помощью цифровых валют, новых технологий продвигать собственные экономические и технические достижения. И мы видим пока, что расчеты между странами БРИКС в основном приходятся на доллар. И даже Китай, да, с его гигантским проектом «Пояс и пути», да, мы видим, что вот этот колоссальный проект экономический, политический, даже там лишь 2% платежей вот, в этом проекте это юань, все остальное это доллар. Да, хотя на Китай приходится 1/5 часть мирового ВВП, да, а вот международных платежах только 2% юаней. Поэтому необходимо и Китаю, и России, и странам БРИКС создавать новые кредитные деньги. Новые, потому что объем предложения долларов может быть ограничен, санкции и использование законодательства как оружие может менять потоки платежей. Поэтому и цифровые валюты, и механизмы на основе расчетов корзинных валют, то есть юаня, рупии, рубля и так далее, они так или иначе позволят сформировать новую мультивалютную систему. Для чего? Для того, чтобы страны БРИКС стали более устойчивыми к глобальным потрясениям. И здесь уже роль региональных платежных систем в следующем десятилетии, наверное, будет определяющая для того, могут ли регионы, страны противостоять возможным негативным явлениям, связанным с асимметрией мировых финансов, асимметрией финансовых систем и накопленных дисбалансов. Но мы также понимаем, что ни экономика, ни финансовая, ни финтех в третьем десятилетии 21 века невозможно без создания центров развития технологий. Потому что в современной экономике главными силами, производительными силами становятся научные знания, информация и человеческий потенциал. И мир сейчас будет делиться на государства, которые способны войти в поток инновационных изменений, и на те страны, которые отстанут навсегда. Наша задача, чтобы страны БРИКС, страны неформального объединения, объединились, чтобы объединение стало более формальным, да, чтобы мы остались жизнеспособны, чтобы мы могли бы координировать наши усилия и взаимодействие для того, чтобы на наших территориях происходило постоянное научно-техническое и промышленное развитие. Да, и мы видим, что разделение мира на технологическую метрополию и технологическую периферию, то, что поддерживало гегемонию Соединенных Штатов, отходит в прошлое. Да, и здесь важна кооперация, то есть есть высокие технологии, это аэрокосмические, атомные, энергетические, цифровые, информационные, включая искусственный интеллект, и финтех, да, как уже показала практика, там сектор коммуникации, биотехнологии. Каждая страна БРИКС так или иначе успела продвинуться и сильна в одной из таких технологий. И объединение усилий и формирование региональных проектов, крупных региональных проектов, такие как инициатива «Пути и пояса», такие как вовлечение там, России, Индии, Бразилии по сути, в соревновании, в гонку аэрокосмических технологий с Соединенными Штатами и в созданием платежных систем, которые станут альтернативой доллару, которые позволят создавать собственные инвестиционные ресурсы во всех регионах мира. Да, вот это то, что, наверное, весь мир ждет от стран, которые сейчас называются развивающимися, но которые в будущем станут такой основой мирового экономического роста, как сейчас весь мировой экономический рост зависит от успехов Китая и Индии. Так и дальше, мне кажется, он будет зависеть от успехов того, как страны БРИКС будут развивать свои технологии и свой финансовый сектор, и цифровые технологии. Ну, у меня пока все.
Спасибо большое, Александр Вячеславович, за такую подробную картину. Я вынуждена снова переключиться на английский, so I'll switch into English. And so I would like to note that I was thinking while our speakers were talking. So we have very different economies within BRICS grouping. So some currencies are based on commodities, others are based on finished goods. So more or less, it's not so easy to coordinate this financial issue. But on the other hand, by the way, we are all high-tech countries. This is really true. So I think that it's a really important point to recapitalize our high-tech cooperation within the group. But anyway, of course, it depends from this common will, consolidation. So how countries are eager to cooperate, to consolidate their efforts. So this is a crucial point, actually. So, by the way, we have one question from the audience, but it is very close to what was already mentioned. So it was asked, could you please determine the intrinsic tenets of the innovation management to organize a cross-sectoral interaction of the productive forces in different territories of the BRICS countries? So we are speaking about cross-sectoral cooperation, I guess, in the productive forces. If the speakers and guests, they have any comments, so please welcome. Can you comment something on the cross-sectoral cooperation within BRICS? Hello?
Perhaps one theme that I would note here is, if we're talking about, from what I understand, the organizational arrangements that would facilitate the cross-sectoral cooperation amongst BRICS countries, I think the role of the new development bank is absolutely crucial in promoting what can be denoted as integration projects, so to say. Such a term has been used across the development banks to denote cooperation amongst various countries that are members of the bank to come up with goods and services where a host of countries is making its contribution. And so accordingly, I think when we look at ways of facilitating this cross-sectoral cooperation across BRICS countries, NDB and its cooperation with the respective regional banks where BRICS countries are members would be absolutely crucial in building a portfolio of projects that can advance projects that have to do with building BRICS value-added chains, regional value-added chains, and that can make use of the complementarities that are intrinsic in the economic nature of the BRICS economies. Indeed, as has been mentioned, the economic foundations, the sectoral foundations of the BRICS economies differ in many ways, and there's significant scope for these complementarities to be exploited. I think if we're talking about specific sectors, I would encourage the development institutions such as the regional development banks and the new development bank to take a closer look at high-tech sectors, computer technology, medical equipment, nanotechnology, etc. I think there is scope for building greater cooperation across BRICS countries. And again, I think one of the themes that needs to be explored to a greater degree is ways of building BRICS value-added chains.
Thank you very much. I guess, or I noted that Mr. Rangasamy wanted to add something. Yes or no?
Yeah, no, sure. Just very quickly, I thought Yaroslav, raised some important issues. The other one, probably relates to cross-border trade. I think currently there's still a lot of trade, priced in US dollars. I think that's another project, that the BRICS country could actually pursue, trying to see whether we can't trade, in domestic currencies. Having said that, I at least from where I sit now, I'm not certain how much of collaboration and cooperation or engagements have happened around, the current COVID-19 pandemic, whether there could be better collaboration, in terms of addressing, the pandemic. At least from where I sit, I think, more could have been done. And, what the constraints were, it's difficult to say. But I think they are, while there's tensions, and this was a point I was trying to make, in my presentation there, is that while there are tensions, on some issues, there are areas where I think there are significant mutual benefits that can be derived, and more needs to be done in terms of identifying them and actively pursuing those. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I see one more question in the chat. What resources of intensive economic growth can we determine in the area of BRICS? Intensive economic growth. Partly, again, we discussed that, but maybe some details could follow.
Well, maybe I'll say a couple of words on this. My conviction is that there are tremendous resources for the BRICS economies to exploit in mutual cooperation and in using mutual cooperation to achieve higher growth rates. And I think one of the themes that is becoming more and more important in the past several years in this regard is the issue of connectivity. All of the countries across BRICS, they are large economies with significant needs for connectivity within these countries. There are significant constraints that are faced by economies such as Russia, for example, for internal mobility, for labor mobility, and connectivity in that regard is absolutely crucial. So again, this serves to show the significant role for NDB, for development institutions in advancing these projects, the connectivity projects that would in activate one of the most important forces of economic growth for the BRICS economies, which in turn is productivity. If you have greater connectivity, if you have greater intensity of interaction and cooperation across regions within BRICS economies, then the conditions for greater productivity growth, of course, are better. And then another theme I think is, of course, the services sector. In the services sector, I think there are very important segments of demand that are still to be satiated, that are still to be addressed. One of the basic ones is housing. If there's a way, again, through the development mechanisms to boost some of the most significant needs across BRICS, such as housing, such as education, such as healthcare, basically themes that have to do with human capital development, this is a tremendous boost to economic growth in these countries.
It's Mike here. Perhaps the only thing I'd add to that is just given I'm a little more skeptical overall, I guess, about the coordination of policies amongst the BRICS. But I think, in terms of NDB, AIIB, and just other uses of sort of Chinese the sort of infrastructure companies, I think there's some lessons that are being learned, and that process is now I think more likely to deliver productivity enhancing sustainable projects for those countries that accept the money from those various institutions. And so I think that augurs well. And of course, the BRICS and again, particularly China are well placed to provide the resources, not just financial resources, but the physical resources, the companies and so on, that can really help on the infrastructure side. But I think it's interesting when you look at some of the projects that, it hasn't just been sort of China. You have seen cooperation, Indian companies bidding on and successfully bidding to be involved in some of these projects as well. And so there, I think there's quite a lot of scope for cooperation. But, related to sort of that and one of the other questions I saw on the chat, I mean, the thing that I would come back to, which I sort of mentioned at the end of my earlier remarks, is just to make sure everyone is really thinking of these economies in an up-to-date way. They really are delivering very high value added. They've moved dramatically up the value added curve, and it's not the same sort of conversations that we were having back in the early 2000s. about what would be necessary in terms of cooperation and so on to get these countries up. And you really do have truly world-class innovation happening in the BRICS, and so I think that's fantastic. But it also probably changes the nature of the conversation a little bit from what we used to have. Thank you.
София, вас не слышно.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Mr. Buchanan, for your input. So we are finishing now. We have to finalize. And during these days, we'll also touch different issues of maybe today's talk. Also, digital money will be discussed tomorrow. And also today, we will discuss this Eurasian integration, also regional aspect. But anyway, it seems to be very important is that, of course, this BRICS format needs to be recapitalized, so to say, from the point of view of cross-regional value chains, alternative financial mechanisms, some alternative cross-regional mechanisms of governance. And so anyway, it's a unique, so to say, cross-continental grouping, I may say so. And of course, it needs to be developed to become more mature from the point of view of the coordination mechanism. So I think we have to finish on that. Let me thank you all for this great discussion. And it was really great to link up from different countries, different continents even. And let's hope we can meet personally in some time in future. So thank you very much for your participating and see you on the next sessions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So next session, 2 p.m. Thank you. See you shortly. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Logan. Hope to see you also. Marc, thank you so much. Great.